You can get it for free.
Can I? Even better.
So there's a free lunch.
New one. You know the
Yes.
There's always
It's not free because you have to
It's
read it.
also very
You want to know what it
good,
says.
frequently.
Time is actually the most precious
All the
resource. You can buy most other things, but you cannot buy time.
Yeah, he's much younger, so he represents another generation.
Yeah,
I think he's
true.
I sit next to somebody on the train from Amsterdam who
Okay.
recognised
Wow.
me and wanted to say, he's
But I
about
met
60, so he
him
says, I've got 20 more
when I
years,
was
this is how much I want to do. I said,
He
20
was
more years,
deputy
what do you do to
foreign
enjoy yourself?
Yeah.
I said, I just want to
He
achieve.
was,
Sure,
Yeah.
he was 60.
for like almost
It's
6
also
years.
time to, keep
And
on
who was
achieving,
the foreign
but the best
minister?
bit of the bit where you're not doing anything.
Yeah, but people who achieved a lot in life,
Several people actually were
so they were overachievers, so they have a bit of a bug. So even once they have achieved, that's very hard to let go. Those who were men and women of the mind.
I hate
So-
that myself. I hate that I can't switch off on weekends. I hate that I can't.
Yeah, but
Because I remember meeting with
yeah, pleasure.
his famous.
Oh yeah, I'm very honored.
The first
Yeah.
after the fall of the
Yeah,
coming regime. So
yeah. What's your first name?
I'm Lisa.
Roman.
no, Petre is
You're from
P-E-R-E.
which one?
I've been many times in your country.
Yeah.
Still involved in politics or not
No,
anymore?
no, no, no. I'm back in my profession as a scientist, a professor in the field of uncertainty.
Okay.
Making, decision making under risk and uncertainty.
It's perfect for this world. Unusual, unexpected. Yeah.
It is. We're missing somebody.
This one.
We're missing somebody, aren't we?
So,
Or did somebody drop off?
we were expecting one more
Yeah.
person, Ms. Chervinska. She's vice president of the European Investment Bank, but she
couldn't
also,
make it.
Yeah, she couldn't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So we'll just be the four of
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
Okay.
enough. I mean, so, shall we start? Yeah. Okay. Am I heard? Can you hear me? Okay, good. So, dear guests, welcome to our session on the Great Eurasia. It's a pleasure to welcome our session, all the guests and all the speakers. A very great panel today. We have a very diverse panel with experts on different fields, in economy, on finance, on national security, on international relations, on history and climate change. We also expected Ms. Chervinska, but she's not with us today. She's the Vice President of the European Investment Bank. So nevertheless, I think we'll have a lot of opportunities and time to discuss all these financial issues also related to Great Eurasia. So I would like to begin with I recently watched an interview of New York Times journalist Tom Friedman on CNBC, where Mr. Friedman said that the era of deep interconnection between United States and China, the era which lasted obviously for almost 40 years, from 1979 to 2019, and was the basis for the globalization as we know it now, for the modern world, this globalization really ensured the growth of the world economy on an unprecedented level. So it's all becoming the thing of the past. So we actually enter a new phase of development, global development, and the world is really different now, even if you compare with 2019, before the pandemic. And Friedman also noted that the economic ties have not been yet completely severed, but we are likely to face a deep decoupling, the consequences of which will affect the whole world and consequently Eurasia, which is my main point of interest because we, in Kazakhstan, we're living in the midst of, let's say, Eurasia. We're bordering with Russia, we're bordering with China, we're bordering with Central Asian countries, we have, through the Caspian Sea, we have relations with Iran and Middle East and South Caucasus. So we're kind of in a mixture of all these processes that are going on in the world today. So, and all these processes affects us, almost directly. So at the same time, we see a continuing slowdown in the growth of the world economy for for 2 years. And the reason, and especially during the last year, the reason is well known. It's the war in Ukraine and the energy and food crisis that followed, as well as the consequences of central bank policies during the pandemic, which led to the record inflation in the world. So 2022 has become a tipping point for conflicts that had been brewing for years. If the COVID pandemic, in some sense, united the world in the search of effective common response to a common threat, the virus. So the war in Ukraine and the sanction policy which followed, by contrast, dramatically accelerated geopolitical fragmentation. In October 2022, the geopolitical risk index rose to 140 points, while in 2016 and 2019, the index was slightly below 99, so it's quite a sharp increase. Geopolitical tensions continue to rise, not only in Ukraine, but also around the world. At the recent G20 summit in Bali, the head of Chinese Communist Party, Mr. Xi Jinping, pointed out that the summit was convened at a time of momentous changes unseen in a century. Changes that are consequential to the world, to our times, and to the history. The growing rivalry between the great powers of the United States, China, the European Union, Russia, threatens to inevitably fall into the so-called Thucydides trap. As you may well know, according to the famous book of Graham Allison, Destined for War, out of 16 historical cases in which a rising power competed with a dominant power, 12 ended in all-out war. So in general, today we're witnessing two mutually exclusive megatrends. On the one hand, the course to deglobalization, the struggle of great powers and regionalism. On the other hand, the trend towards further deepening of globalization is objective, and we in Kazakhstan and in Central Asia, we see this trend, especially with the growing connectivity. So today, being in 2022, we do not know which trend will be dominant in the future. It is quite possible that globalization will continue, but in a different form. So today, Europe and Asia, long divided macro regions on the Eurasian supercontinent, are in fact already part of a very closely intertwined, interconnected single economic space. Eurasia accounts for about 65% of the world economy and about 60% of the world population. So today it is clear that a single Eurasian economic space has enormous untapped potential. The phrase from Zbigniew Brzezinski, famous book, The Grand Chessboard, comes to mind. Eurasia is the center of the world, and he who controls Eurasia controls the world, the end of citation. In this context, the Central Asian region can play a really key role in being located at the heart of Eurasian supercontinent. And geographically located at the heart of Eurasia, Kazakhstan is at the center of all these tectonic shifts, and all global transformations affect us most directly. Today, more than ever, we feel the need for an honest and open dialogue, even despite sometimes radically opposing views. Therefore, our session is called Building Dialogue in an Age of Uncertainty. During this session, we'll discuss a number of strategically important questions. What will happen to globalization? How will the Ukrainian war end? And what aftershocks await us after this? What will be the post-war security architecture of Eurasia? Either a way out of the current stalemate, and what role can Central Asia in particular play in this process? What risks and opportunities should we prepared for? I hope we'll discuss all these issues during today's session. I would like to welcome our distinguished guests once again. Today we have brought together experts who are rightly considered to be the leading intellectuals and visionaries of our time. These are renowned experts in their respective fields: politics, economics, finance, security, climate change. Thank you for agreeing to speak at our event. Let me introduce to our guests Mr. Nouriel Roubini, on my right side, Professor of Economics at the Stern School of Business, New York University, CEO of Roubini Macro Associates, the world's foremost economist who predicted the great financial crisis. Ms. Liza Curtis, a well-known national security expert, served as a Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States for National Security from 2017 to 2021, and is currently Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the Center for New American Security. Mr. Chung, Raekwon, member of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, expert on climate change issues, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And Mr. Peter Frankopan, professor of global history at Oxford University, author of The World, bestseller of The Silk Roads, A New History of the World. I would like to briefly discuss the format of the meeting. Since we are limited in time, I consider it appropriate to hold our panel in the format of live discussion, and after short remarks of no more, I hope, than 5 minutes from each speaker, go straight to the Q&A part. If time permits, there will be also an opportunity to ask a few questions from the audience. So let me give the first word to Mr. Frankopan, who, from his position of a historian, I think could see the picture in a much like macro way. So then we can go down to more like specific issues.
Oh gosh, well, thank you, Yerzhan. Thank you, Mark, and the organisers for having me here. It's never best to go first when you're with a Deputy Assistant to the US President, a Nobel Prize winner, a director of the organisation, and Nouriel Roubini, so it's absolutely terrifying. I suppose as a historian, this comment that you mentioned, Yerzhan, about that Xi Jinping mentioned that we were living in unprecedented times, a lot depends on one's global perspectives. I mean, there are always technological changes, there are always climatic movements, maybe not quite as dramatic as we're seeing today, but historians make you think that there's a time of the past where everything was stable, no one argued with each other, and things were always going to go back to the world where we communicated. But you could look at things in different ways. In the first instance, what it is we do very well in the world. So rather than catastrophizing what the problems are, one might take the view that, all things considered, given 30, 40 years ago, no one thought we'd be able to sustain a population of 8 billion without mass starvation. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, up until February this year, essentially through non-violent means, was something that I'd not been brought up to expect as a young man. I assumed that we would end in nuclear catastrophe, and that possibly we're in a better position than we might think in terms of how we're able to negotiate the challenges coming towards us, which are hugely profound. And I'm sure that others on the panel, particularly Professor Roubini, will talk about some of the mega threats coming towards us, but the one I'm most concerned about is, of course, climate, because that's extremely hard to resolve around the discussion table. It's a systemic challenge that we have created the tools of our own destruction. So I think that's the one which maybe we could talk about a bit later. As far as the comments of Brzezinski or Harold Mackinder, the idea that you can control the centre of the earth, well, I suppose that's fine if you're a colonialist or an imperialist and you believe that you should control things or are able to. But certainly, Mr. Saltybayev is correct about the centrality of connections. I wasn't here for this morning's session on connectivity, but connectivities require what our friends in Beijing call win-win scenarios. That doesn't always mean equal win-win, but the world where you agree that you're going to cooperate and collaborate. And in that sense, the decision about deglobalization is a fairly straightforward one, which is deglobalization means higher prices. And that may be a political choice that you choose to make that is more important than a social choice or an economic choice that you make. But there are worse things in the world than redistribution of capital. It doesn't have to be a catastrophe if we decide to build factories here in France where we make trainers or laptops and whatever. It'll just be much more expensive. That's the first point. Second, where you do need to globalize is where there are key resources that you require. And we're learning that in Europe, the painful way, which is the overdependence on Russian energy, failure to invest in clean technologies that we knew about it from 1970s onwards, about the importance of being independent of fossil fuels and oil from a political and economic point of view. It means that we know how to adapt. And that's a question of political structure and political resilience, I think, in the world we live in. The challenge, and we're not wanting to anticipate what anybody else might say, is that governments can be very resilient. It's when problems come in waves and they come quickly. So if you had a choice, you probably wouldn't be wanting the war in Ukraine to happen at the same time when monetary policy had produced 14 years of basically free money from central bankers. You probably wouldn't want it with COVID and the debt that's put onto developed nations and the political, economic and social problems it's put onto the developing world or the global south, low-income countries, I think a better word. And so the problem is the cascade of being able to adapt at fast pace. And we here in Europe have a different set of cards to the ones in many of the states in Central Asia. For example, our sudden interest in nuclear technology means that Kazakhstan's importance as the top producer and processor of uranium in the world means that Kazakhstan's shift is not just towards fossil fuels and the minerals that it has, but specifically around national security, around the ability to have access to minerals. And so the trick, I think, is to work this out from every single side. The Central Asian states, Kazakhstan in particular, is, as Mr. Saltybayev said, in a tricky neighborhood. You probably, in a game of life, wouldn't want to choose the Russians, the Chinese, to be your neighbors alongside other problems in the region, which have, in fact, of course, turned hostile. The tensions between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have seen militarization and contact between armed forces, and then, of course, how things play out with Iran, India, Pakistan too. But as a historian, what I can tell you, if you haven't read my book, it's a very good Christmas present for your friends and family, is that people who live in these difficult neighborhoods are quite good at telling which way the wind is blowing. I followed very closely President Tokayev's visit to Moscow yesterday and the surprise announcement by Putin that he wanted to consider a new union between Russia, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which Putin is trying, I think, if I've got it right, trying a new union with Ukraine, which hasn't turned out to anybody's advantage. I think what he's talking about in this particular case is gas, but Tokayev did exactly what a good president who's been trained in diplomacy should do, is to say it's a very good idea and we'll go and write a very, very, very long report about it, and then we'll think about it. And let's hope that the Russians don't do what some of the Russian TV talking heads are promising they'll do, which is to put Kazakhstan on the list after Ukraine of a territorial expansion. So these are extremely difficult, uncertain, challenging times. President Xi at the 20th Party Congress in Beijing last month, in his close-up speech, he said that it was his view and the Chinese Communist Party's view that people around the world should live in peace and harmony and grow prosperous together, which is a very nice idea. Right? No one's going to argue with that. The question is, how do you find the tools to make that happen? How do you find the contacts between political leaders, and in fact not just the elites, but around all sections of society, to understand what those benefits of globalization is? And talking for my own part, here as a European, we probably haven't done a very good job at explaining the benefits of globalization and the costs to everybody in our societies. Our societies have become significantly more unequal in the last 30 years, and there's a price to pay for that. And I'm afraid to say that the price that we pay in the United Kingdom is Brexit, which has its own challenges too, maybe not as important as invasions of Ukraine or the Chinese economic situation, and in fact also the political situation. So these uncertainties only get solved with the very clever title of this session, which is Building Dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll discuss in more details after everybody will express their opinions about the overall subject of this discussion. So thank you very much. And the next floor is given to a member of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Mr. Chung. Raekwon.
In the time of uncertainty, one thing certain is climate change. So we have to do something about it, as Professor Roubini mentioned in this book. So what should we do? We cannot just be a bystander. We have to be driving some actions for climate change. For this issue, I've been thinking about how can we synergize economic growth and the climate action? Because at the moment, we are stuck in a situation where economic growth is undermining the climate sustainability. So we cannot continue this kind of trade-off between growth and climate. So I was thinking about this dilemma, and then I came up to the conclusion that we have to come up with a green growth idea, which means that investing in mitigation should be a driver of economic growth in the long run. Of course, not in the short term, but in the long run. So I proposed this idea in green growth in 2005 and adopted a ministerial declaration in the UN for the first time in the UN system. And maybe some might remember that green economy idea was having so difficulty even in UNEP to be officially adopted. But green growth, I was pushing that idea for 10 years. And still, it's still in the infancy, still is not taking off. We still need a little bit of a different approach of economics approach. The free market system that is not internalizing the carbon price into the market price, we cannot achieve synergy between economic growth and climate sustainability. So when I promote this green growth idea, there are two countries came out. Number one is Korea. Korea took up this green growth as a national vision of Korea. Then at that time, President Nazarbayev from Kazakhstan was so impressed. And he picked up this green growth idea and translated that Kazakhstan would be a green bridge between Europe and Asia through green growth idea. So the President Nazarbayev promoted the Green Bridge Partnership Program. And from the UNESCO at the time, I was a director there, and I was supporting this green growth partnership. Now in Seoul, there's a Global Green Growth Institute is now operating, and the World Bank and OECD is now working for knowledge partnership for green growth. So there are a lot of effort to operationalize the concept of green economic growth using investing for climate mitigation as a driver of a new economic growth, still in the making. But it still have to be, a lot of work has to be done to maximize how can you do that. So one of the most important topics I can identify and suggest here is how Europe and Asia can discuss to collaborate to materialize and operationalize synergy between economic growth and climate action. So this is one area of Greater Eurasia dialogue. The other one, which I would like to propose, is the Silk Road Supergrid. Since the Professor Frankopan is a writer of Silk Road, I'm proposing Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to be a production center of wind and solar power, and transmit it to Korea and transmit to Europe. Because in Korea, we need a huge amount of renewable energy, and we have a very limited land space. 70% of Korea is a mountain, and we have no way we can satisfy our green energy need within the Korea. We need to have import a lot from outside. And Xi Jinping proposed a global energy interconnection, GEI, in 2015. So when I was thinking of the Silk Road Supergrid idea is that Central Asia can be a production center for green energy and just transmitting to Europe and Asia. And I think technologically there's no problem. The SoftBank chairman, Masayoshi Son, he came out with a report saying that there's no problem of technology. It's all available. Economics are fine because he said that the production cost is only about 5 cents per kilowatt. Transmission cost can be 2 to 3 cents. So selling it at like 15 cents is making a lot of economic sense. So all this equation is fine, except only one thing is politics. And then I believe President Xi might find it interesting because this kind of a Silk Road Supergrid can be a very interesting idea to legitimize one belt, one road idea as one of the contribution for global common good. So this is something that could be a very interesting subject for your Greater Eurasia dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So next, I would like to give floor to a well-known expert in the field of geopolitics, former Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States for National Security, Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the CNAS, Ms. Lice-Curtis. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saltybayev, and thank you, Mark Azan, for inviting me to this very important conference. And I have to say I'm a little intimidated being on the panel with such renowned experts, but it's certainly an honor for me. And I'm going to talk specifically about Central Asia and its changing role amidst the shifting geopolitical landscape. Until this year, very few would have questioned Russia's dominant influence in Central Asia. However, I think the tectonic geopolitical shifts that are occurring, particularly following Russia's war against Ukraine, are certainly raising questions about the extent to which the Central Asian states will allow themselves to remain heavily reliant on Russia. Russia, of course, had been building security ties within the region through the Collective Security Treaty Organization, had established the Eurasian Economic Union to increase regional trade, Russia had been providing 80% of arms imports to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. But this past June, at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, when Kazakhstan's President Tokayev stated that Kazakhstan did not recognize quasi-state territories, sent a clear signal to Putin that he would not be able to count on unwavering support from its neighbor to the south, especially on questions of territorial sovereignty. President Putin expressed his displeasure at Tokayev's statement by temporarily halting the transport of Kazakh oil through the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, the CPC pipeline. Thus, Kazakhstan is beginning to recognize the cost of being overly dependent on Russia for exporting its oil. And in 2021 alone, the CPC transported around 1.3 million barrels per day of Kazakhstan crude oil through Russia. Of course, Kazakhstan must walk a fine line in standing up for territorial sovereignty of nations while also maintaining a working relationship with Russia, with which it shares a 4,800-mile-long border. China, for its part, is looking increasingly towards Central Asia for trade and transit corridors and market opportunities. Beijing has come to rely on the rail route through Kazakhstan to get its goods to Europe. China, of course, had been investing in the energy sector in Central Asia for many years, but these infrastructure investments picked up considerably following its unveiling of the Belt and Road Initiative in Astana in 2013. And with that speech, China was signaling a new focus on investing in countries on its periphery. And China described the effort as allowing countries to benefit from Chinese economic growth and success. But the concept also, of course, involves China securing energy, resources, and expanded trade routes, and in many cases, securing access to strategic infrastructure like ports or energy grids. A few years prior, of course, in 2009, China had established the Central Asia-China gas pipeline. And just this past year, China conducted $48 billion in bilateral trade with the Central Asian nations. So let me just say a few words about the Belt and Road Initiative, since it was mentioned by the previous speaker. Of course, some of the BRI projects have been positive for economic growth and development in the region. And the problem stems from the lack of transparency in Chinese lending. Beijing doesn't report official lending, and the risks of its infrastructure loans are often hidden from the recipient. In 2014, China started the Silk Road Fund to finance BRI projects through the China Development Bank and China Exim Bank. The BRI, of course, has had a negative impact on the debt profiles of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan in particular. Nearly half of Tajikistan's debt is held by China. So in terms of U.S. policy toward Central Asia, I think the Central Asian countries certainly welcome other countries like the U.S., European nations, to start investing in the region, making their presence felt. The Central Asians, like other countries, of course, want choices. They are concerned about Russian and Chinese hegemonic goals, especially the February 4th announcement of the No Limits Partnership announced between Russia and China. And we see European leaders reaching out. Somebody mentioned earlier today, the European Council President was in Central Asia in late October, and he mentioned that Central Asia is a bridge between Europe and Asia. The EU's top diplomat, Joseph Borrell, visited Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan just 10 days ago and attended the connectivity conference and was there to promote new links between Europe and Central Asia. So the U.S., like Europe, also has an opportunity to step up its game in Central Asia. Of course, it's not going to be able to match China dollar for dollar or supplant Russia's deep cultural influence in the region, but U.S. support for Central Asia's independence and sovereignty is valued, and I think it provides the U.S. with many open doors in the region. So what can the U.S. do? The U.S. should find ways to encourage development of Caspian energy reserves and trans-Caspian energy corridors that link Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Europe. The U.S. and Europe can both coordinate on infrastructure alternatives for the region. In fact, the Center for a New American Security, where I work, we recently published a report titled Competitive Connectivity, Crafting Transatlantic Responses to China's BRI. We make several policy recommendations in that document. I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but things like supporting local journalists and research organizations to conduct fact-based inquiries into BRI projects, thereby allowing them to be monitored, the projects to be monitored, and keeping all parties accountable. The U.S. can certainly do more to support intra-regional cooperation, and it already does through its C5+1 engagement. And the idea is that by promoting inter-regional trade, connectivity, and cooperation on other areas, you're building a stronger, more resilient region. And I think this is more important than ever with the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. We haven't seen any change really in the Taliban. We see the policies toward women as backward as they were in the 1990s, maybe even worse, with women above the age of 12 not being allowed to go to school, simply unheard of. No other country in the world has ever tried to limit females' access to education. And in terms of counterterrorism, we see that the Taliban's still linked to terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. So it's a dangerous region, it's a dangerous country, and it's more important than ever that the U.S. engage with the countries of the region, build up their counterterrorism capacities, and encourage the countries to work together against extremism and terrorism. So I do think there is an opportunity for American and European influence in Central Asia to grow, but only if we come to the table with the high-level attention, the high-level visits, investments, assistance, and demonstrating that we recognize the needs of the region, which right now are focused on inflation, unemployment, the need for new export routes. We have to remember the things that are important to the region. I'm just going to end with a few words about the U.S. national security strategy and what it says about China in particular. I think it's important. The strategy, which was released just a couple of months ago, certainly highlights strategic competition with China as the most consequential long-term strategic challenge to the United States. And it lays out a strategy for addressing that challenge that relies heavily on cooperation with allies and partners. It highlights several initiatives that the U.S. Has already taken. Of course, we're 2 years into the Biden administration, so it was handy that the strategy wasn't released until there are already several initiatives underway, which the strategy could highlight. Things like the AUKUS initiative between Australia, the UK, and the United States, which is all about deterrence, showing that the U.S. must rely on its allies and is willing to give its allies the capabilities that they need to help deter. The Quad, this is the US, India, Japan, and Australia working together on strategic issues like emerging technologies, vaccines, space, and other sort of non-security related issues. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative. All of these initiatives are aimed at preserving a rules-based order. And the strategy acknowledges that democracy is at the core of American identity and that the United States still has a role to play in standing up for the values of democracy and human rights. But it makes clear, the strategy makes clear that Washington will not limit its cooperation to other democracies, but will work with any country that respects a rules-based order and wants to join in quote-unquote constructive problem solving. But the NSS also highlights that the U.S. wants to prevent its competition with China from devolving into conflict. It states clearly that the U.S. has not changed its Taiwan policy, does not support Taiwan independence, and that the United States still supports the one China policy. And lastly, it makes a notable distinction between Russia and China. On China, the emphasis is on competition. It very much leaves open the possibility of peaceful coexistence between the United States and China. But on Russia, it talks about, quote unquote, constraining a profoundly dangerous Russia. So I think it's worth noting the differences in tone on Russia and China. Now, some in the U.S. are arguing that the U.S. should let Europe deal with Russian aggression. The U.S. needs to focus its attention on the Indo-Pacific and should shift its resources and focus on deterring China, since that's the long-term issue. I think that's wrong. That's a wrong way to conceptualize the challenge. I think it's about working together, the U.S. and Europe working together to deal with Russian aggression, and the U.S. working with its allies in the Indo-Pacific to deal with any potential aggression there. The U.S. does not have the luxury to deal with only one of these challenges, but paradoxically, it cannot deal with both challenges alone. It needs the assistance of its allies and partners to deal with what are interconnected challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Curtis, for your very broad picture of what is going on around Kazakhstan. We're a tiny country, but you know we would like to live in a more safer place, but we cannot change geography. Okay. So yes, indeed, the United States has interest in all parts of the world, and we hope that all these tensions and skirmishes between the EU and China will resolve in a peaceful way, because it will mean that we could live in a more or less stable neighborhood. So next and the last of today's speakers is Mr. Nouriel Roubini, who doesn't need any introduction. So please, Mr. Roubini, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, the topic of this panel is about greater Eurasia in age of uncertainty. And those of you last night heard me speak about my new book, Mega Threats, know about the variety of severe threats that can affect the global economy, the planet, and peace and progress and prosperity for us. However, I will make the following observation. I think in the beginning, Peter was speaking about unprecedented uncertainty. We live in times of unprecedented uncertainty. I would say we live in times of unprecedented, unusual, unexpected uncertainties. So 4 use rather than 2. It's a world of lots of risk, volatility, uncertainty, and threats of one sort or another. That's a first observation. Yeah, and ambiguity, of course, and so on. The second observation about greater Eurasia leads me to what one of the great geopolitical thinkers of the US said in the 40s, Nicholas John Spikeman. He said, who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world. And of course, for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, going back even to the Greeks, various types of global powers and empires have tried to control the Eurasian land as a way of controlling pretty much the world. And when we talk about Eurasia, we can have this greater Eurasia definition that goes all the way from Vladivostok to Lisbon, including also the Middle East, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Or for the purposes of maybe this panel, given the speakers and the sponsor, maybe a more narrow, definition that concentrates on the Caucasus and Central Asia might be more relevant. Caucasus being, of course, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and the other stan countries, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and you name it. We know that today there are at least 4 global powers who are jockeying for influence, if not for control, of Eurasia. One is Russia, the other one is China, the third one is the Europe or the European Union, and the fourth one is the United States. And I'd like to talk about what are both the strengths and weaknesses of these great powers and how they affect then what should be the strategies of these Caucasus and Central Asian countries in terms of how to balance different political and geopolitical and economic powers. First observation on Russia. Russia, of course, wants to restore its former empire and claims influence and control on the former Soviet republics. It's near abroad, in part because there are ethnic Russian minorities in some of these countries, but in part, I think, is because it has also always had imperial dreams that are now becoming imperial delusions because it's a severely declining power. The main strengths of Russia are, one, hard power, but that hard power actually, given what happened in Ukraine, it's more is nukes than actually conventional military. And the second one is commodities, energies, and others. If you think about the weaknesses of Russia, they're multiple. First, there is a demographic decline, 160 million people and falling, and you have only 17 million of them in Siberia. And how are you going to control Siberia? There's a landmass bigger than US, Europe, China, and India together. Secondly, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was a country in economic decline where potential growth is barely 1%. In a typical emerging market, it's 4 to 5%. In Russia, it was 1%. And given the sanctions against Russia, both the energy and more importantly, the technological ones, Russia is going to be in terminal economic decline for the next few years. 3, it has very little economic diversification, is essentially energy and commodities, and suffers of the typical Dutch disease, that you don't diversify and you become essentially corrupt and relying on rents coming from resources. 4, militarily is also weak, as we saw in Ukraine, and it's only powerful because it has the dangerous control of thousands of nuclear weapons. And 5, it's even at risk of losing its own territorial integrity in Siberia, because climate change is going to lead China and other powers, with billions of people having to move more north to places like Siberia that are going to become environmentally viable. So my lesson is, if you embed yourself too much with Russia, you're really aligning yourself with a loser country. So that's a main message I want to give. Secondly, China. China is a country that is both strong and weak in different dimensions. Of course, has become a major global economic, trade, financial, investment, political, now geopolitical power, and is a success story. For 30 years was growing 10%, but then growth fell to 5%, and right now potential growth is probably much less than that. It's a country, however, that has a number of weaknesses because China may at best be stuck into a middle income trap, where given its current policies and demographics, potential growth might not be better than 2 or 3%, or at worst, it could even have a hard landing because of its own economic and financial imbalances. Those weaknesses include state capitalism, rather than opening up more to the private sector, bashing actually the private sector in many ways that reduces the confidence of entrepreneurs, a series of imbalances, sector imbalances, regional imbalances, inequality imbalances between rich and poor, urban, rural imbalances, and imbalances between the power of the corporate sector and the one of the household sector. The risk of country that, while looks like technologically dynamic, it may not become truly innovative in the knowledge and technology of the future, given its model of state capitalism. It's a country that has high debt, high leverage, and has had a growth model based on credit-fueled fixed investment. It's a country that politically is becoming more authoritarian rather than less authoritarian, and having all the power in one person eventually leads to policy mistakes, like the zero COVID policy. It's a country that is flexing now is a geopolitical power across Asia, if not the world, but has few really strong allies around the world. And it's a country that ideological, unfortunately, right now is becoming even more Maoist, Marxist, Leninist. If you read the recent speeches by Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who's a China expert, he says that's the ideology of Xi Jinping. So what does that mean? It means that if you have China is going to become stronger, it's going to become more aggressive in Asia and globally, trying to assert its own power. But if China becomes weaker, could also become more aggressive in Asia and try to take over Taiwan because it has to find an external enemy. And by the way, China has territorial disputes not only over Taiwan, but also with Japan, with the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and India. So if global conflict, hot war may occur, actually the starting point more than in Europe with Russia there might be actually in Asia, given the types of territorial disputes that China has with a number of countries. If we think about Europe, of course, it's a region of great strengths, advanced economies that have been successful, that are now integrating regionally with economic, trade, monetary, and even political integration, the European Union becoming bigger over time. It's open kind of economy that is integrated with trade and investment with the rest of the world. It wields a lot of soft power that is matters, of course, in this world, and is using its economic gravitas to influence global rules and regulation on trade, investment, and even technology. And finally, the European countries are mostly liberal democracies that believe in rule of law and a rule-based international order. Those are, of course, the positive of Europe, but there are weaknesses. There is aging of population in Europe and now restriction to migration from outside of it. It's behind the US and China in the technology and industries of the future, AI, machine learning, robotic, automation, quantum, and you name it. Lots of theoretical work, but not very many applications. And that combination of aging and low productivity growth implies low potential growth. It's also energy importing region and dependent on, until recently, Russia. And is going to live in a world where probably energy prices in real terms are going to be high. And the economic model, say, of Germany based on manufacturing and cheap energy is one that right now is challenged. And finally, Europe lacks hard power and relies on the support of the US to deal with the Russian bear. And unfortunately, in a world of greater geopolitics, soft power is important, but is not sufficient. Having some hard power is also important. If you look at the United States, of course, the strengths of the US are that it's an economic superpower, a technological superpower, still a military superpower, an energy independent superpower right now, and is still right now a liberal democracy, even if there are lots of risk, even of liberal democracy in the United States. What are the weaknesses of the US? It's a country that is politically polarized, where there is no bipartisanship, there is extreme partisanship. People now are writing books about civil war, violence, secession, and extreme populism. That may happen even in the United States. It's a country in which there has been a rise in income and wealth inequality and economic malaise. That's why there's a populist backlash against the elites and populism of extreme right or extreme left. It's a country that is now less willing to use or flex its military power globally, given many mistakes in the past, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and you name it, and now the very large fiscal cost of projecting that kind of power. It's also a country that is losing soft power because it's seen around the world effectively as being a bully that bullies countries to essentially follow its own desires. However, important caveat, the US has provided the security for the Eurasian continent since 1945. NATO and Europe against the Russian bear, and the security of the US, friends and allies in Asia with a rising China. So that's something to be kept in mind, that the peace, prosperity, and progress for the last 75 years of the Eurasian continent are on one side in Europe is the United States, on the other side in Asia is still the United States providing security, both in Asia and in Europe. Now, what are the implications of all this picture for these countries in Central Asia and the Caucasus? I think there are several, I would say. Implication number one is that you have to continue and maintain some kind of a pivot and balancing yourself among major powers. You have to diversify your friends and allies. Relying just on Russia or China or US and Europe doesn't make sense. You live in a dangerous world and you want to have many friends and many allies. Second one is that if you rely too much on the Russian bear, that's going to be for you more of a threat politically and geopolitically, and more of a bane than a boon for yourself over time, both economically and otherwise. 3, the Chinese panda conceptually believes in a world where the Middle Kingdom, China, is the center, not just the world, but is the center of the universe, and is the only legitimate empire, while all other nations should effectively be vassals and tributaries of the Middle Kingdom and of the emperor. And today China doesn't have a president, doesn't have a king, it has an emperor, Xi Jinping. 4, Europe believes, of course, in a rule-based international order, and that's good. And the fact that Europe wants to engage with Greater Eurasia or Caucasus or Central Asia, it's very important. However, there are some caveats. One, unfortunately, Europe doesn't have hard power. It has only soft power. Secondly, technologically is becoming, relatively speaking, a midget compared to the United States and China. And 3 is energy and commodity insecure. So its ability of projecting that influence on Eurasia has those types of constraints. On the United States, I would say the following thing. The US may at times be a bully, but is the only economic superpower that has both economic, financial, and monetary power. Technological is a superpower. In energy and commodity is becoming a superpower. It is still, from a military hard power and security point of view, a superpower. And it's the only country that has so far guaranteed the peace, prosperity, and progress in the Eurasian continent. So it becomes an indispensable force that actually can maintain that peace, prosperity, and progress. So it's a power that should be recognized and respected in spite of many of its mistakes. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roubini, for a very, very broad picture and I would say an analysis of all these stakeholders of Eurasia. So I'm afraid that we getting around out of time. So Mr. Roubini here has a flight very, very soon. So I would omit my first question, and I would ask the audience maybe if you have some questions, just raise your hand and okay. So yeah, please.
Thank you. Well, I really enjoyed a lot what has been said during this panel, really. I'm coming from a country like Romania, between Eurasia and Western Europe. Eurasia was mainly about Russia for many historical periods. Russia and then Soviet Union. Until the beginning of the 60s, China decided to stop being the little pet of the Soviet Union and to follow its national Chinese strategy. And of course, they launched the famous Open Up reform, triggered by a great man, Deng. And I feel like there is a very basic question. Why, where the Soviet Union failed so badly, China succeeded so brilliantly? In 40 years, China pulled out of poverty 740 million people, became a huge economic power. Well, it's because open up, because they became a real market economy opening their economy to free movement of its own people, to free and active cooperation with the world, and they succeeded greatly where Soviet Union, with its isolation, its ideologically dogmatic society, failed miserably. And now, shouldn't it be more important for China to learn from its own lesson and to continue the same path? Free market, free and active cooperation with the world, and refraining from an excess of ideological stamp. It's just a matter of simple learning from a lesson. Of course.
Excuse me, sir. Can you be more specific in your question?
So
like,
that's
if you have a question. Oh, okay. So who would like to answer? Is anybody?
Yeah, okay, well, so you say an open up free market. China's not a free market. I think that's important. It's completely asymmetric. China has access to our markets, and that's not reciprocated. I think that the challenge is that why the two didn't work the same way is arguably the Russians were more serious about their political philosophy, about what communism meant, and they were locked into the challenge of a Cold War. Off the back of Tiananmen Square, which happened the same year that the Berlin Wall came, which is the kind of great spectre of what the kind of Chinese Communist Party needed to avoid, taking gas out of the system, was the way in which that happened. But clearly today, as already been mentioned on this panel, Xi's personality and his view about Marxist-Leninism is the key shaper of political decisions that shape the economy. So China has been very successful in raising people out of poverty. One reason for that has been its rise has not been in the framework of a Cold War and a Thucydides trap. One of the questions, as was mentioned by Mr. Saltybayev, the Thucydides trap seems to have taken everybody in the United States by surprise. The idea that China getting stronger and richer would be a problem. And one of the problems that people like Her Excellency Ms. Curtis has to deal with is what does a wealthy China look like if it stays as a Marxist-Leninist state? If China's economy keeps growing and they spend more on their military, at what point is that a threat to the United States? Which bits can be taken off the table about technologies which are okay for Chinese to become more and more wealthy? And that's not a question I think that's been answered particularly well by successive US administrations around, now it's how do you keep the pot on the Chinese, the lid on the Chinese pot. I mean, for what it's worth, the role of Hong Kong was fundamental in China's rise of bringing capital into China and allowing Western businesses to set up shop in where there was protection of some form of law, British law at the time, before that was essentially knocked out a couple of years ago by Xi. So there have been lots of reasons why China's got to this point. If we'd been sitting on this panel a week ago, a few weeks after Xi had been crowned unprecedented third term, no one would have thought that China looked fragile. And over this course of the weekend, the kinds of things that many of us in this room have been asked about and thinking about is, might the House of Cards come tumbling down? How fragile are these big structures that are top-heavy? As Professor Roubini mentioned, when you have authoritarianism, you make mistakes because one person always at some point makes mistakes. So these roots of what China might look like in the future looks to me extremely uncertain. For what it's worth, and I'd be interested in what the other panelists think, China's role in the coming 10 years, let's say, looks to me extremely challenging. If I was a central banker, being a central banker in Beijing is probably the job I'd want, maybe not least, quite interesting, but it would be a very difficult hand of cards to play because the structural problems that Professor Roubini mentioned are extremely deep. And at some point, that houses of cards of all autocracies falls. So in fact, and it's the last comment I'll make, when you said this was a Russian project in Greater Eurasia, for the largest part of its history, if we look back over 3,000 years, the people who've controlled Eurasia have been the nomadic peoples. And they've done it extremely successfully, of which Kazakhs, of course, are important descendants. But the Mongol Empire was very successful for 600 years. The Ottoman Empire, which had a big stake for 700 years, lasted. The Huns and so on, these empires that we tend to think are violent, chaotic, are extremely good at modulating responses to commodities, energies, resources, demographics, and climatic changes. So in fact, it's just the structural world where we do things in a different way that things look slightly different to me. So that's a shout out, I think, to where we might look at history, not just starting in the last 100 or 200 years.
So, and Ms. Cruz, would you like to respond? Yeah.
Just quickly, you asked the question about whether China has learned from the long-term structural decline of Russia. But, I think in Washington, we're more consumed with a more immediate question. And, what lessons is China taking away from Russia's invasion of Ukraine in terms of whether or not it tries to unify Taiwan by force? So I think that so far, the lessons are good in that the U.S. and Europe have shown a very unified response. The sanctions have been adhered to. They're starting to hurt the Russian economy. China maybe realizes that it needs to remain engaged with these economies. It doesn't want to suffer the same kind of sanctions that Russia suffered. So I think so far the lessons hopefully are the right ones that China is taking away. But that's the more immediate question in Washington right now.
Just what I'd like to say, one comment. If the US had reacted in 2014 when Donbass and Crimea were annexed, the world might look slightly different.
Okay. And yeah, the next question is a lady in the second row.
Yeah, I have a question, a general question. We talk very rarely about the sovereignty of these countries. Take Kazakhstan, take parts of the Eurasian countries. We are always speaking about the influence and the interdependence. But I wonder, what could a path for sovereignty look like? Same thing actually for Europe. How can we become strategic sovereign along many dimensions to be better partners internationally? Because we know that we have an issue about extreme interdependence, and that extreme interdependence creates a lot of problems, and therefore we need to find a path for stronger self-assertion and stronger sovereignty. And the question is, what is the view that you have on creating sovereignty, in various areas? I mean, there are very many areas of sovereignty: energy, certainly military, certainly security, certainly technology, and we can go one after one. And I would like to hear, your view about this, about the region.
So, anybody would like to answer the question? Maybe, Mr. Chung.
Based on my experience of negotiating climate change for UN for 30 years, maybe the resilience can be a very interesting concept to be applied for sovereignty. And I remember a very interesting case when China failed in Copenhagen negotiation, climate negotiation, because China rejected the verification of their emission reduction. Then China got all the blame of the failure of a Copenhagen agreement. So the rigidity of the concept of sovereignty, I think, is a losing game, and the countries should be resilient in exercising the concept of sovereignty. I think that will be depending on the level of maturity and the society. I think it is a concept. Maybe the resilience can be best applied for the concept of sovereignty.
Yeah, I would also like to ask a question to all of you participants. So basically, so now the whole dynamics of this year began because of Ukraine. So Ukraine becomes so-called black swan. So nobody expected it to happen in this disgusting way. So and now Russia is becoming more and more ostracized and more like isolated and in a cornered. So do you think that it is a really viable strategy for the West to pressure Russia until it will become like a part of like a greater China, or is it better to find a way to resolve this? Maybe not on, of course, not on Russian terms, but at least on some mutually agreeable terms, so that Russia would feel at least save the face. And secondly, it will not have the only option, like to join a great Eurasia in the sense of like Russia is becoming a part of big China.
Yeah, I mean, given current trends, probably there is this alliance that in principle has no limits between China and Russia, and the dominant power in that alliance and friendship is China. I think that, the US and the West might have made mistakes after the collapse of the Soviet Union towards Russia. I don't think that the strategy has been perfect, but I don't think that the US or the West or Europe had any territorial ambitions over Russia itself. Decided that some of the Central and East European countries should be members of Europe, Eurozone and NATO, some of them but not others. And it would have been in favor of a Russia that becomes economically more open, more integrated with Europe and the West, and politically remaining something of an imperfect democracy, but a democracy. Things have gone sour for a number of reasons, and I would say until there is this regime that is run by Putin, there is no way that the West can reopen to Russia. Yeah, from a long-term perspective, Nixon went to China because at that time you had the Soviet Empire and you needed somewhere to contain it, and the right thing was to open it to China. And some people like Kissinger today would say that since the biggest threat to the US is China, then we need to have in Eurasia an ally that is Russia. But the Russia under Putin, with the particular policies, military and geopolitically, cannot be a viable candidate for friendship with the West. So at some point, the Russian will have to change regime, realize that that alliance with China is going to be geostrategically a nightmare, as essentially China is going to take over Siberia and economically Russia, and maybe it is in the self-interest of the Russian over time to re-engage Europe and the West in a more constructive way. Until that change occurs, I think we're stuck with the current situation.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The only thing I would sort of, clearly China is the senior partner in terms of its economy, its capacity, potential, etc. But Russia's carrying a lot of water. Russia has pulled China into this in February with the eternal friendship. The Russians promised the Chinese they understood how the world worked. They promised a quick victory. They promised that they were good at doing the international diplomacy that China's been conspicuously bad at for the last 30 years. I mean, it's something to announce Belt and Road initiatives and to fly around the world, but China's been conspicuously bad at creating alliances and friendships, and that shouldn't be the hard thing to do. That's the easy stuff. So the Russians, I think, have dragged China along with this, and I think have put China in a much more exposed position. Of course, the terrible thing now is that China's learned a lot of lessons of what happens when you do shut down your systems. How do you become more resilient? And that will probably accelerate China's decoupling from some of the things that probably were not in our interests in the first place, but it's specifically starting with climate change negotiations. Sure.
Yeah, so you asked whether or not Russia should be pressured or find a face-saving way out. I would say, pressure Russia until it respects Ukrainian sovereignty and independence. If Russia decides it wants a face-saving way out, I'm certain that can be worked out. People are very creative with these kinds of face-saving mechanisms, but a face-saving cannot mean infringement on Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. So it really depends on what you mean by face-saving. If you're talking about, some ceding of territory, I don't think that is really the kind of face-saving that is going to work. And let's not forget, Russia was part of the G8. The door was open for Russia to be part of the rules-based international order. Russia made its own choices. That's why we are where we are.
Yeah, but the question is about the framework of this agreement. Obviously, nobody talks about Ukraine should give up all its claims about territorial integrity. But obviously, Russia doesn't see the territorial integrity of Ukraine the same way. At least Crimea, from the Russian point of view, belongs to Russia historically. So, is it could be at a point of discussion or at least some compromise in your view? Crimea is Russian and the rest is under the negotiation, etc.
I'm not going to negotiate for the Ukrainians. Okay. That's what I'm going to say. But like I said, if Russia truly is looking for a face-saving way out that preserves Ukrainian sovereignty and independence, I'm sure something can be found.
Okay. Do you have any more questions? Yes. The sir. Yeah.
I'm Pasquale Orselli from UCP and OMFIF. thank you for the very interesting outlook of the concept of Eurasia. But then the next narrative is going to be Africa. How do you link the, how would you comment within your outlook the ascent of Africa? Thank you.
Is it anybody here expert in Africa? Remember, from the climate point of view.
Actually, I'm not sure whether there's the increasing importance of Africa in the context of Eurasian dialogue, or I think still Africa is a kind of a destination for ODA and a lot of soft support, especially for climate change, because damage and loss, all these issues. So I don't think it'll be something that we can think of as an equal partner, but rather to be a partnership, to be a supporter, to be supported by climate change and other issues. I don't think it can be an equal partner for dialogue for some time. Yeah.
The big problem with Africa is the lack of regional trade. The interconnectivities between different parts of Africa is extremely low. It's about 15% of its GDP comes from African trade internally within the continent. And so its integration into global supply chains, that may well happen with manufacturing. There might be homes that are needed for apple factories that aren't in Sichuan province, where the water shortages mean that factories get shut down for a month in the summer. It might be that political and economic decisions, that manufacturing moves to places like Morocco that's 5 miles from Spain, and an easy access point into Europe, the United States and beyond. So I think those connectivities can all be built. I mean, as Mr. Chung says, it's how does that connect to the global Eurasian landmass? But clearly the process of globalization and access to our markets is one that we maybe should try and think about doing a better job than we have done in the past. And to Professor Roubini's point about demographics, we're going to see a boom probably in West Africa with a doubling, possibly trebling of populations. And that creates all sorts of opportunities for infrastructure investment. The problem from our Eurasian example is that China and its Belt and Road Initiative, as you know, in Kazakhstan, more or less stopped funding in about 2018. Little bit still in 2019. Xi in the 20th Party Congress last month mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative twice, once in a second paragraph after the free port of Hainan, which is not a particularly important element. So although it's in China's constitution, the Belt and Road looks increasingly like it's something philosophical, metaphysical, and a nice sort of narrative history to join people together rather than something that's hard. We in the West and the States keep announcing blue dot networks, build back better networks, global gateway is the latest thing that we announced in the EU, but our taxpayer dollars or money doesn't go into buying infrastructure. The challenge, we talk about trade and free trade with Eurasia. Basically, we in Europe want to extract resources from Kazakhstan, for example. We want the oil, the gas, and minerals. We don't really want to give anything back apart from cash. And that level of interaction is probably not a particularly healthy one if you're not able to help build infrastructure and move social mobilities and all the kinds of metrics that we'd want to see. So I think some of it, in the case of Africa, is about learning some of those lessons and working out whether we really think people in other continents have a way in which they could be integrated in a much, much better way than they have been for hundreds of years.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. So is anybody would like to raise a question? Okay. Okay, let's finish this panel because we sorry? Oh, okay, yeah, sure, sir. Ambassador Abusseitov.
Yes, thank you very much. And because the Greater Eurasia itself, and this is one of the important elements of the activity for this time being of Nazarbayev Foundation, especially Astana Club. This is a concept. Still, we need to elaborate this concept because before we are looking to build some dialogue in the age of uncertainty between whom, and in my understanding that we have some contradictions or some new elements in many different understanding of the speakers of this panel because it was absolutely different understanding what Greater Eurasia is. Is it a continental thinking or continental concept? Or this is a post-Soviet area or something like this? Because in many cases, it's absolutely the response on this particular issue, it will be absolutely different. Because when we started work on this, and the main obstacle and the main difficulty comes to us not from economic, not from political, not from everything. Philosophy, mentality. If we're trying to think about the greater Eurasia as continental concept, continental thinking, it will be absolutely different viewpoint, absolutely different results. The second one, about the Central Asia. As usual, I'm saying about that Central Asia and Kazakhstan, we are so tired to be a bridge between East and West, because this is already a substantial part of the world. And because in many cases, in the concept of the greater Eurasia, Central Asia, yes, of course, play absolutely very important role. Because instead bridge it means what? Because you have some great gap between this part and this part of our continent. And in this occasion, we need a bridge. But this bridge may be collapsed, maybe rebuilt or something like this. But in our understanding, what we are proceeding from the understanding that Central Asia, in this particular occasion, needs to be as a tube for ideas, tube for blood between this part of the continent to another. And this is a historical role of Central Asia. And I totally agree with Mr. Roubini that we have to think about the Central Asia, the greater Eurasia as a continental thinking. Because this is extremely important in my understanding, especially now. And after that, it will be much more clear for us how to build a dialogue. What kind of the way to build a dialogue and what kind of dialogue, with what portion of dialogue we have to start, to continue, and to finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. And I want to express my deep gratitude to all the speakers and participants for interesting questions and discussion. I hope to see you again in the Dialogue of Continents. So thank you and good luck. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's been really on time. Yeah.
A program at my think tank, a virtual program on
Actually, you know, I
national
think that this
security. I think it's
good analysis. I mean,
today.
SWOT analysis. Yeah. Pros and cons, etc.
Would you possibly be interested in seeing
Online, I guess, critical supply. Just recently, I read a report from the Bundesbank. I think they have like 270 critical components for the industry and Germany, and out of these 270, 200 are imported from China. So it's not viable to disengage from China. No, disrupting the whole industry. Yeah, no, I agree with that.
well, she's such a star.
Time is critical,
She really
but I think that over time there'll be greater decoupling US and China,
She was really behind that.
and Europe will decouple less, but will also decouple partially from China, because US, whether they like it or not, they have to support the US and NATO in Asia. If the US wants to maintain the protection of Europe against Russia, so geopolitically, Europe is going to have the US in Asia. And China has had economic practices that have been harmful even of European business and technological interest in ways that are intellectual property theft and other things. So Europeans are becoming increasingly also concerned about that. And then there's the security issue of 5G, AI, and you name it as well. So it's complicated. Hi. Okay. One second. It's for you, right?
Yes, Ariel Cohen. Yes. You know that.
No, I'm actually taking a couple of days to see my friends and go to a museum. And, tomorrow and Thursday, I'm leaving Friday. What about you?
Oh, we're also staying here for we're also staying here for like a couple of days. Yeah.
Good. Enjoyed your presentation yesterday. Yeah. Tremendous.
Oh, thanks.
Big picture is important.
Nouriel,
Yeah.
can we go?
Yeah. Yeah, somebody wants me to sign. Let's go and do it.
Why am I on the far right? Left. When I was at Heritage, I made jokes about it, but I'm so much in the center these days.
I just wanted to say that I will probably have to live in the middle of your panel.
I won't take
But
it personally.
I was, planning to, listen and ask questions, but yeah, I have to catch my plane, and I was warned that there might be some long queues. So
You're on what? Oh, you're in queue.
yeah.
Take a look at our website.
Yes.
You might find some interesting things.
Yeah, we had discussion yesterday about your plans with the Nobel Peace.
Oh yeah, that'll be interesting.
Yeah. So I can send you some.
You go to the website of the Nobel Summits. I've been the main writer of their statements for the last
Well, I
years.
can send you some of the ideas about.
Please.
Cannot?
Absolutely. I took down your notes of what you said. If you have any ideas, send them to me.
I'll be curious also to do the same way. I mean, I am going to an event about North Korea and have some meetings.
If you have any ideas or anything that you should brief me on, send it to me. Absolutely. I don't consider myself an expert on that at all. Well, my role is mainly to listen to what the laureates have to say.
Yes, we're discriminating.
And they'll give opinions about things they don't know anything about quite comfortably.
Okay.
It's like rich
Yes.
people,
Can I
they think,
ask
oh, I
you
made
a
a lot of
favor?
money, so I must know stuff about everything. Oh, I won the Nobel Prize, so I know how to make ice cream. I mean, please. It's like that, yeah. Sure, yeah, drugs are good. Thank you. I got it here. Thank you. Thank you.
Девушки сказали, что молока. И заменить... у меня есть сахар, я с собой скушаю. Не волнуйся.
So I don't know what I'm going to talk about.
Oh, you can answer Mr. Chung. You got your stuff. I think you have.
No, I'll find a polite way to.
Tell him to go find the Russian chef.
Yeah, exactly. No, tell him I'll go and work for. What is it? I'll go and work for Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong.
No, tell him he's working for him. By sowing discord in the Democratic Party. So there are more people on the panel than in the audience.
Yeah, sorry?
This is what you get for being on the last panel. More people on the panel than in the audience. Wow. У вас студент? Регулярно?
Maybe I'll ask some water or something.
Тогда не надо. А, с газом можно? Окей.
Chairman, I have to offer, but I have a few.
I'd love some, so shall I pour some? I'll pour some for you. Would you like some water or something? No. Pass that and I'll put some in for him. Not for me, thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Short term. You're studying political science, not medicine, right? That's what I studied at Fletcher. Where are you in Sciences Po?
No, thank you.
Как у вас сейчас все в порядке?
For your master's или Ну, нормально. Я в министерстве сейчас вернулся в министерство. Да, должен быть небольшой дисклеймер. After this. You know about Fletcher, right? In the States.
Вам еще до пенсии еще?
Ну, мне еще до пенсии еще служить.
Я уже 4 года на пенсии.
Это хорошо.
Nobody wants to hear from nuclear weapons stuff.
A break, yeah. I'm not surprised.
Well, if you want people to leave a party, talk about nukes. That's why we're here.
Just to say the overview a little bit about the global alliance.
I'm checking your notes.
After the panel, let's
See what the boss has got.
tell me what you're doing, I'll tell you what I'm doing.
Okay,
Chop.
so I'm number 5, am I?
Yeah.
Do strategic planning how we defang Mr. Chung. Just kidding.
А что, наши ушли, дайте? Наши ушли, по-моему.
Все ушли на фронт.
Sorry?
Is that mic permanently on?
Sorry?
The microphone, I think once they switch it on, it's permanently on.
I know, but it's
It's off at the moment.
really
I'll have to share with you.
on or off?
It's off at the moment.
On.
Take that away. I cannot. I'm not allowed. I'm not allowed. I don't have permission. But my wife's not here. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
No, it's delicious.
You're so humble.
We are very disciplined.
Merci beaucoup.
What about the rest of the forum?
Take it home.
Maybe so we may to start. And good evening to everybody. And first of all, let me to start our next session and the next panel discussion concerning the Global Alliance of Leaders for Nuclear Security. What is the title? Because first of all, I would like maybe to thank the Mark and that such kind of, we discussed with you that it's practically the new element in the concept of your dialogue of civilization regular meetings, because if before it was devoted definitely to economic issue now, so you introduce new elements. It means that everything is interdependent, that international security indivisible, and that's why so we have to start with very important issue concerning the nuclear weapons non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament, and nuclear security. First of all, I would like just to introduce some information to our audience concerning the Global Alliance of Leaders for Nuclear Security and Nuclear Weapons-Free World. And it was born in 2019, and it voiced, and it is an initiative by the first president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, and he did it during the Astana Club 5th meeting in 2019. And after, when he addressed the Astana Club regular meeting in November 2019, he stressed the growing global demand for a genuine platform for advancing anti-nuclear agenda, and as such proposed establishing of the GAL, Global Alliance of Leaders. It was very interesting idea to find a way, because it came from Kazakhstan, as you know. And because, first of all, the Kazakhstan, it was before fourth arsenal in the world of nuclear weapons, deployed in the territory of Kazakhstan. And what is the difference between, for example, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine in the territory of these two countries deployed nuclear weapons too? Because on the territory of Kazakhstan, it was the uranium production. It was the reactor BN-350, fast breeder reactor, which is the weapons plutonium were elaborated. It was Ulba metallurgical factory where the nuclear weapons were built. And it was Simple Atoms nuclear test site where these nuclear warheads were tested. In accordance with the NPT Treaty, the country which provided on their territory the nuclear tests before 1967, they have a right to be a nuclear weapon state. The Kazakhstan is one of the unique example in the world which has provided denuclearization of their country, closed Simple Atoms nuclear test site, if rather different nuclear test site in the world, as in the United States, in China, and in Russia, they're in silent. But this test site closed forever. And I mean that this such kind of initiative, because this such kind of initiative came from Kazakhstan and from the first president who did the first decree of his presidential decree in 1991, it was the closing the Simple Atoms nuclear test site. For this time being, starting with working on this particular idea, first of all, we have 60 endorsements from, for the open call of 2 years back, and currently the alliance brings together now 87 prominent political leaders and international experts from 45 countries. In May this year, so we established a strategic planning group of the GAL, and practically 1, 2, 3, 5 members of this strategic group with us, and if I may say so, it will be something like a little panel of discussion within the framework of the goal. And we have 2 very important Professor Cohen, who devoted his speech and he devoted his intervention to the problem of the nuclear energy. It is unique forum, unique NGO. Why? Because we trying to incorporate, firstly, in the world, 3 elements in one basket: nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament, and nuclear security. All of them. And we did it very successfully, because when we started it, I was not so optimistic, because we will have some different viewpoint on this. Some part of our colleagues, they insist that nuclear security will be the first, and nothing to do with nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament. But in case, but finally, so we came to a decision to include these elements in one basket. And now, so it is evident that we took a very right decision. For this time being so, we are, first of all, I would like just to thank all panelists, all speakers of this panel, because this is if I may say so, top international experts on this in this particular direction. I'm very glad to see all of them here on this table and to be speakers on our panel. And my understanding that since our last meeting in Vienna, so many things have happened and still happening in this particular direction. And my first question and my first, if I may so, proposal to my colleague to start with this particular issue. What have happened during this period of time? What's new elements coming to us during the last half a year, and what we have to do in order to respond to such kind of challenges or another. And I would like to invite all participants of the SWG group to during the dinner to one round table and to continue our discussions on what we have to do within the framework of the Global Alliance of Leaders. Because now, so we'll have limits of time, but Mark, my understanding that my session is the biggest one, and that's why so I am asking for additional 10 minutes, if it will be possible. Thank you very much. And the first warning and the first floor, please, I would like to give to Angela Kane. It's very prominent persons, and Vice President of International Institute for Peace, former UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Please, floor is yours, Angela.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Abusseitov, and I'm actually very honored to be here and to be with all of you, and I'm very happy to see a group of good friends sitting around the tables here. Very interesting conference, a lot of it has been said, and frankly, one of the advantages of being one of the last speakers, or let's say the penultimate panel, is that a lot of it has already been said. So I was looking over my notes and I thought, what am I going to cut out? Because I don't want to repeat what has already been said in very interesting sessions that I followed. But one thing is very clear, is that we are really in the third millennium, which is totally reshaping the world in a variety of senses. And we've been used in Europe to basically growing prosperity, life is getting better, and yes, there have been some bumps in the road. There's been the 2008 financial crisis, there was the war in Syria, big migration crisis in 2015, then came Brexit, but on the other side, we never thought that anything could really fundamentally change. And I think that this is really changed dramatically in terms of our expectations, because our sense of security was not only already shattered by some of these events beforehand, but the outbreak of COVID-19 has really made a huge difference. And no one has mentioned this, and I was very surprised that it hadn't been mentioned before. But we were woefully unprepared to pandemics, because when you look at it, there's over 6 million people lost their lives in the world. And 2.5 years later, the disease is still with us. And the geopolitical tensions increased during the pandemic. We've talked already about climate change as a major disruptor. And then, of course, we have had now the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is in its 10th month, or rather, it has been 10th month since it has started. And so what are the consequences, not only for Europe, but also for international relations? And since we're dealing with nuclear weapons, I must tell you that the worst case scenario is really the crisis escalating into nuclear warfare. And there are two possibilities. And the first one, a very real one, is focused on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which supplied 30% of the Ukraine's electricity prior to Russia's invasion. It's been basically occupied by Russian forces. They've been in control of the nuclear power plant since March, while Ukrainian technicians operate the facility. And just in the last couple of weeks, we have heard a lot more details under what conditions this has happened. And I must tell you that it's really very much of concern that people have had the strength to actually continue working and continue maintaining this nuclear power plant while it was essentially under an occupation. And the other problem is that we have never had a situation before. There's no way of dealing with this because it never happened before. No one ever thought that this could actually happen. But the other issue is that it could actually result in a nuclear catastrophe unless there's certain requirements that are still being fulfilled in maintaining the nuclear power plant. And the other possibility I wanted to mention, even though it's not nuclear, is also that Russia has made repeated threats and maintained that Ukraine is developing bioweapons. And there has been evidence, I think also from the global partnership, that this is not the case. I'm mentioning this because it is a series of threats that have come out of Russia against Ukraine. But on the other hand, it could also be a false flag operation where basically Russia could possibly use bioweapons against Ukraine and maintain that actually this was coming out of Ukraine. Now, the second scenario very clearly focuses on the possible use of a nuclear weapon. And I think that the taboo against nuclear detonation really appears to be losing salience. The Russian invasion has upended what has remained of 60 years of bilateral US, Soviet, US, Russian arms control agreements. And Putin has recently made statements that he would prepare to use a nuclear weapon in the event of a threat to Russia's sovereignty. Now, I should also mention that just yesterday, the last existing agreement, New START, was actually about to meet between the two countries, and that was canceled unilaterally by the Russian Federation, saying now was not the right time to meet, and therefore it would be postponed or it would be taking place later, and they did not say when it actually would take place. So that is very much a concern as well. The other issue is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, as we know, just held its 10th review conference in August this year, postponed by 2 years because of COVID. And it did not end with a consensus final document. It's still being sorted out, what does it really mean, but it doesn't mean a good thing. And basically it was done on the objections of Russia, because there were some language that Russia objected to, also relating to Ukraine. But on the other hand, I think it does not spell good news for the continuation of the non-proliferation, and we need to do our very best to basically shore it up. Now, the last time there was such a high level of danger, in nuclear issues particularly, was the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. But we have to remember that at that time, there were only two players involved, and that was the US and the Soviet Union. And I must also underline that all it took was 13 days. 13 days. Today, the crisis involves multiple players, as we know. It's not only Europe, but also NATO. And NATO's strategic concept leaves no ambiguity that it is actually nuclear weapons which are the ultimate guarantor of NATO security, even though there is the appendix that it is seen as very remote. But when you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is not a global war. It is a regional war, and it could drag on for, I believe, a very long time, because each side wants a political win. And there's, of course, a different interpretation of what does a political win mean. But how resilient is Europe with regard to the energy dependence? How resistant is Russia against sanctions, against political isolation? But in short, the peaceful world that we knew no longer exists. And nuclear arms control has been the victim of all of this because it's lost its place totally in the current security landscape. People don't talk about it anymore. It's a dead issue right now. And what we're dealing with, as we've heard in the previous sessions, is also that there's a much more complex geopolitical environment. Let me also mention that there is the nuclear deal with Iran, the JCPOA, which was cancelled by former President Trump. It was close to agreement earlier this year, but now it seems very unlikely that it will be saved. If Iran will indeed build nuclear weapons, the region, the Middle East, might plunge into a very dangerous arms race and possibly a spiraling confrontation with Israel. Neither the US nor Iran appears to consider concluding the deal a priority, and the increasing US focus on the anti-government protests that have wrecked Iran recently have fueled the very hostile atmosphere between the two countries, and that puts the deal even more on a downward trajectory. Let me also mention in Northeast Asia, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a constant destabilizing factor. The DPRK is able to exert this outsized influence due to the support of China and Russia, which are clearly not interested in curbing Kim Jong-un's ambitions as a nuclear power. And DPRK, as you may have known, has passed legislation to further enshrine its nuclear weapon status in September, and aggressively continuing to launch missiles despite the harshest UN sanctions that have ever been imposed on a country. They want to be recognized as a nuclear possessor state, and they could well be, in my opinion, because both China and Russia may actually recognize them as a nuclear possession, and that would further erode the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And of course, there's been a lot of talk already about US and China, because these were the two bipolar powers, superpowers in a bipolar world before the war in Ukraine broke out. And I think that they will remain in those positions after the war ends. Russia was a middle power before the invasion of Ukraine. It had an overrated military, particularly as we now seen this year, but it was using its veto power in the United Nations Security Council to very great political effect and projecting the message that Russia counts on the world stage, no matter what. Now, Nouriel Roubini said in the previous session that Russia will emerge from this war greatly diminished, and I totally second that statement. Even with the alignment towards China and Putin attended the Olympics, I think that what we have basically seen is that having Russia as a junior partner has really strengthened China's role and influence globally and confirms the current US-China bipolarity. And what advantage will China draw from these developments? I am greatly worried by all the wobbling that is going on right now with what is happening in China. I mean, it's just been in the last couple of days that we've seen this tremendous outpouring of revolt against the COVID measures. I don't know what that means, and I don't want to speculate on it. But I do think it's, again, a destabilizing factor that is entering the geopolitical landscape, and we don't know exactly where it ends up. And there was a comment, I think, also in today's earlier session that authoritarian regimes kind of make mistakes in the end. And I think that could very well possibly apply to China as well. Now, I think that when we look at the bipolarity between US and China, it's still very important that we look at the history also. Because the US was mentioned and is and was a predominant global power. But on the other hand, when you look at it, it has 85 military bases in 85 countries. As a global newcomer, China, for example, has 3. And this has formed China's narrative and the frequent complaints about US meddling in regions far beyond North America. And that's also something we need to keep in mind when we look at the geopolitical situation, particularly surrounding Taiwan and the South China Sea. I do want to mention one destabilizing force, and again, it involves one nuclear power, and that is basically the illiberal forces in Asia. Prime Minister Modi has reshaped India and strengthened Hindu nationalism. In the Philippines, former President Duterte has undermined the country's democratic institutions and rule of law, and his successor's policies, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., are still in the shaping, but Myanmar, equally, military seized power in February last year from a democratically elected government and is brutally cracking down on dissident voices. In the US, we know the political scene is incredibly difficult for President Biden. It's polarized. It's very hard for him to get agreement on his political agenda. And illiberal forces are also in play in Europe. I mean, we just need to look at the developments in Hungary and in Poland. So that basically makes a very unstable situation globally, not only Asia, not only Russia, not only Europe. And so what will happen is that with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the transatlantic military alliance will become more muscular and assertive and also more robustly funded. But the rupture of ties with Russia carries great risk because it not only affects Ukraine, it affects all the states of the former Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain. And now we feel even stronger that we live in a very dangerous world and which we have no agency over some of the forces that are against him. Now, let me mention finally that our existing collective security mechanisms, to which I also would include, of course, the NPT, are under strain. The agreements, the management tools that were developed by various bilateral agreements, United Nations, Organization for Security and Cooperation Europe, etc., basically are out of sync. They are no longer fit for the task. They just don't apply anymore. So we need to think about this. And the focus, in my opinion, has to be wider than just military and security issues, because even if they're now the eye of the storm, we will have to live together in some kind of a global community later on. And we need to safeguard the space for dialogue and even if the space for diplomacy has shrunk, because inevitably, in the end, there are going to be diplomats and politicians sitting around the table to define new borders, new behaviors, new rules and regulations, as unlikely as that seems now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. And if you remember, so last time, so we say we're not so optimistic, and in May with the results of the NPT review conference, and it was the result, nothing.
Let me just say that it wasn't a nothing result. I must say that we had the meeting. I think that there were also important statements being made, but in essence, no one was really very happy with the document that was not adopted in the end, because people felt that it was too wishy-washy, did not really have commitments, it didn't really live up to the expectations that were on the table beforehand. But of course, all of these expectations were just brought to naught. And the other problem that everyone saw is you had only in January, a month or 5 weeks before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you had an agreement by the P5 nuclear powers that an atomic war or nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. 5 weeks before the invasion of Ukraine. So that was basically an extreme disappointment of all of us who had great hopes that maybe there would be proposals, maybe there would be commitments coming out of the NPT, but none of them were done. And it is not only due to the Russian Federation, but I think also the other 4 nuclear powers were not exactly forward-leaning in terms of making commitments to disarm.
I'm just remember, such as in 2005, we were so optimistic, and especially this resolution about the building nuclear weapons-free zone in Middle East. And in 2022, optimism disappeared. But anyhow, so thank you very much, Angela, and I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Lassina Zerba, His Excellency, former Executive Secretary, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. Please, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Sador. I mean, when you give me the floor after Angela, she basically, we speak the same language because we've...
I know about this, that's why so we
finalized
with such kind of language.
We've been in the same system for so long, and then we've been working closely together. So I'll try not to repeat what... sorry. It's okay? Yeah. Okay, so we try. I'll try not to repeat what Angela said, and then give a little bit of perspective from where I come from. You mentioned the CTBT. So right now, since last time we met, where are we? We're trying to avoid a catastrophe, nuclear war, and also a catastrophe in terms of the nuclear power plant that is under siege right now, as mentioned by Angela. So we have a combination of deterrence, transparency, diplomacy, and export control, which is basically what brought some of the institutions that we have. She mentioned the NPT. I'll add the IEA framework, the CTBT, 1540 resolution, and then lead into this extended deterrence for diplomacy in order to create an environment for innovation and verification. That's basically where we're at. And the challenges Angela mentioned, US, Russia, Iran, Israel for the GCPOA, if you want to talk about it, the DPRK, and then China. So diplomacy and arms control, you mentioned. You talk about the 3 points: nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament and arms control, and then nuclear security, the three that are taken into account in the Kazakhs' exceptional experience and unique experience. So overall, what do we need? I think we need public support in all we do, because public support is a center for gravity. If you don't have public support in what you do in terms of nuclear disarmament and nuclear and arms control, non-proliferation, you go nowhere. So we need public support. At the same time, we have a public opinion that seems to now believe that getting nuclear weapon gives you a license for aggression or a safety for yourself, with regard to others. So one can be optimistic in that free minds or free men will always be stronger than autocratic regime. And that leads me to the philosophy that there is a culture that should dominate and then other that should follow. And that's why I hope I didn't hear that we shouldn't be in a framework where, partnership should be in equal footing, but we can come to that later. So culture, soft power, I think that was mentioned earlier today. And what I want to bring as a norm, the norm that I know, the norm that I lived in when I came to Europe to study, is that as older generation who hew a more hierarchical and differential, because that's the mood that we were brought up with, as those passed away, we have a new generation that take their place, and then people who increasingly embrace universal, libertarian, and then egalitarian value. We can say emancipative. That's basically what we see, or what we should see, at least my generation. But I think things are becoming different in Africa, because the generation after me, instead of following that step, they're facing a trilogy that is security, development, and a weakened institution. And with those 3 points, there's no way they can follow that acceptance that things should be different than what they've seen. So they come, and that's where you see civil society nascent. And I was in Halifax 10 days ago, where somebody was giving the example of civil society that handed 27 or nearly 30 years of regime in Burkina Faso as a great example of civil society. But right now, civil society is getting politicized. And when civil society is politicized, they lose the essence that should give them that nature of being independent, self-sufficient, and self-reliant. And then when you have this all mix, nothing works, or nothing can work in the continent in terms of the rule-based setting that is basically given, or, that transpire from this part of the world. So now, instead of, I think it's Dr. Frankel who said yesterday that it doesn't mean that we should close ourselves in a room and then have a window where we look out and then see roses in the garden and not being able to pick them. we should work together, because it's all together that we will meet those challenges. There's no room to think about closing ourselves in a region, sub-region, or any form of commonality that could exclude others. I don't think that will work in a world of globalization. We have to remember that, yes, democracy speaks to the vulnerable, but is the vulnerable well-equipped to get the message? And that's the question that we should all ask ourselves. And when the vulnerable is not equipped to get the message, what do we need? We need to lift people up to a certain level of education, of understanding, of training. That will basically get them to think for themselves, to act with purpose, and then to be able to make a decision themselves with regard to anything that we talk about, be it nuclear disarmament, being the risk of a nuclear war, being security, development, or even democracy. If we don't get that, we go nowhere. We can fix in one part of the world, but if the other part of the world is in a complete shambles, they will contaminate each other. And that is what I see. Europe can see Europe and look to Indo-Pacific, but Europe is too close to Africa to live with the problem next door and not try to find a way to solve it. When I say problem, it's by all means. So, when we talk about autocratic regimes, but one thing we have to know is that they seem to be resilient. Because while we talk about them not being the mode of conduct that everyone should adopt, they seem to get echo in some of the countries. And they get echo in some of the countries because people are lost. Because youth that represent more than 70% of Africa have no future to look into. And when they have no future, what they try to do is to see what is the weak point that we can lean on to, and then come together and then start fighting for something that could be with no real meaning. So we have to rethink the complexity of social mobility, historical inequality, and deal and manage cultural diversity the best way possible. And what is more needed today in all aspects that we discuss is a kind of cognitive mobilization that could inspire and empower people, as I said, to act with purpose and then think for themselves. If people can't think for themselves, forget it. So rather than accepting a received authority or an wisdom. So you have to help people to think so that they can make a choice, and then they can decide for themselves. And that leads me to the other aspect of what Angela was talking, the energy crisis and the need for energy, and how yesterday and a couple of weeks ago when I joined the Africa Energy Week, I wish some of you were there to listen to what was said, because basically I was lost in that environment. I was trying to talk about nuclear energy, and then people were telling me, we don't care. We represent 4% of whatever people talk about. We want to have fossil fuel. And then that's basically what made the COP27 as difficult from the African perspective with regard to getting an agreement. And that's something that we should think about. Where do we sit with regard to nuclear energy, nuclear security? Technology has evolved. I was happy to meet somebody who is coming from Luxembourg, who is working in London, trying to develop small modular reactor, which is a field that I'm involved in right now, because technology has evolved. And what we need, it's an energy mix that allows everybody to find something. Allow Africa to say, yes, technology has evolved. We can have a mix of renewable energy, but we should consider nuclear energy the same way others have done, because there is more security, less proliferation risk. And then this is something that we have to work on slowly as we deal with the proliferation issue. So to finish, what I want to say is that we have to do our best to not give the wrong perception to youth in Africa. When I go to South Africa, or I go to some other part of Africa, be it East or West, when people look at what's happening with North Korea, you talk about people who just watch TV or see social media and then react to it without knowing exactly what it means. Because what they will tell you is that the reason why the North Korean leader is surviving is because there's a perception that he has nuclear weapon. And then the question they will ask you, when I was working in non-proliferation disarmament, they say, but Dr. Zerbo, why are you trying to tell us not to have nuclear weapon? We need that so that people will respect us. Mm-hmm. And then some people will tell you, if we had nuclear weapon in Africa, maybe we'll be in the Security Council. You see, I'm just giving this example to show how difficult it is to help people to be over some of the wrong perception that could have. And that's what I'm saying to finish, that we have to do our best to change things, to think differently, and then to help others in lifting them and their knowledge up to a certain level where we can all speak the same language. Thank you.
Thank you, Yassine, as usual, for your very deep and very important presentation. And in my understanding that the public activity is extremely important now, and I'm supporting you totally, 100%. And you're saying about the new philosophy. Yes, we need, now is the time that we need new philosophy in the international security as a whole. And in this particular direction of the nuclear weapons proliferation and disarmament and nuclear security as well. And is coming in such kind of, especially in the, such kind of, we have the period of time. I know that Angela doesn't like nuclear saber rattling, but at any case, if, for example, nuclear saber rattling became something like in the day-to-day language of the leaders of the states, this is a harmful. This is a problem. What kind of new philosophy we need before, ahead? We learned from the Ukraine case a lot, and new elements is coming from day to day in our practice, and in my understanding that the United Nations now, for this time being, needs to learn very, very deeply the old situation, what we have now, and to produce something new as a proposal for further discussion within the framework of the United Nations, and within the framework of the NPT Treaty Review Conference, because we have to save NPT Treaty very much, because this is a single mechanism what we have now for this time being in the nuclear weapons non-proliferation. Thank you very much, Lassina. And I would like to present the floor, to give the floor to Urban Rosnak, Ambassador and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Slovak Republic, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear Kairat, dear friends. So, since we last met in roughly years ago in Astana, many things happened, and also for me, I'm not anymore representing the International Energy Charter, but I returned back to the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs, and I have to make a disclaimer that I'm speaking.
I said Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Yes, but I'm speaking on my in my personal capacity. I do not represent Slovakia right now in this very, very important meeting. When I was looking into the topic, what we will be talking today, and also very humble listening to my two fellow speakers who are speaking before me, I was trying to find my niche. What we can say to this topic. Indeed, we are not such a glorious history as Kazakhstan giving up the nuclear weapons and to go through all this process, and I'm deeply valuing. I think this is such an important step which has been done on the onset of your nation and the nation building, that it cannot be but prized by all humanity, by all members of the United Nations, by all your neighbors, because this is something really which, especially in the light of the recent developments, shows that how important this was and what kind of difficult consequence such a brave decision may have for a country. I will speak about situation in Ukraine. It happened to me that I was serving as ambassador of my country to Kiev between 2005 and 2009. So whatever is happening there is very close to my heart. And I'm a little bit personal as well, because Slovakia is a neighboring country to Ukraine. So since the situation happened in February 24 and Russia invaded Ukraine, we have seen a influx of refugees, of fellow friends and colleagues coming from Ukraine. 100,000 of people went through Slovakia, and several dozens, they're still there, living there, and we are trying to help them as much as we can. But when the situation was evolving on the ground, and we know that one of the reasons, or one of the possibility why these aggressions happened, is maybe very much linked to what Dr. Zerbo said, Lasina said, that while Ukraine also was in a very similar situation than Kazakhstan, and they gave up their nuclear weapons. And it was a well-known Budapest Memorandum guaranteeing, according their nuclear status and sovereignty. And it's really very hard to imagine that such an experience will be not reflected in a broader international community. This is something which is a completely different story of the successful Kazakhstan and something that's happened in Ukraine. Why is it so important for Slovakia? For us, it's not only the issue that our neighbor has been attacked and aggressed by the even bigger neighbor, but we had an experience in 1968. Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia at that time, and we have seen this coming. We have seen Soviet-Russian tanks coming to our country. So also regarding to the nuclear weapons, so we never had the nuclear weapons. Only when Russian Soviet forces left, we realized they have been stored on our territory in some places nuclear warheads or nuclear bombs. We have been not even informed. This was in the old good days of the Warsaw Pact and so-called socialist regime in Czechoslovakia. So therefore, we are very much sympathetic to the situation what happened. So but I have also to admit that I have 30 years experience of being a diplomat and serving my country. But I was never ever could have imagined myself that we will be facing this type of situation when our neighboring country has been attacked. There will be a threat to using the nuclear weapons in 2022. There will be a threat to use the nuclear power plants as a target. It's still in fresh memory in my country, the fallouts of the Chernobyl disaster. So you see, it's like a building to the old wounds. So to put the push of the old wounds which happened in the last 30 years in our area, and everything is concentrated now. It's happening now in Ukraine. In Slovakia, we are trying to support our neighbor as much as we can. It's very difficult to imagine any other solution but to restore territorial integrity of Ukraine, because I told you, we are in the very same situation. We are the smallest, Slovakia is the smallest on all our neighbors. So basically, without politically guaranteeing our borders, so we cannot survive. Even being a part of the EU and NATO, which provide for us kind of a security arrangement and international arrangement, we feel still vulnerability. It's very deep in our historical memory that we need to take care of this and we need to support we have to avoid the changes of the frontiers by force. Regarding to the other part of the story, the nuclear energy, I will just stop here. Slovakia is one of the countries which is actively using and still building nuclear power plant capacity. As we are speaking right now, the third block of the Mochovce nuclear power plant is being phased into the grid, and the fourth one is due the next year. So we are one of the not many European nations which do believe in the nuclear energy, which we do believe in the importance on the control of on the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty control, and we do understand that importance of the old blocks that have been built up on the past. as we mentioned and before, are essential for a peaceful and successful development and a peaceful development of nuclear energy. Having said that, I will conclude on a less optimistic way, probably, if it will be less optimistic. What I also witnessing personally is the decline of institution. So I think that we are in a period when the set of international institutions which have been created after the Second World War are not fit anymore for the purpose. And we have this crisis of institutions, and it is very hard to imagine in this fragmented world how to handle the new situation if our toolbox is getting outdated or we are not willing to use it for very different reasons. I will stop here, and I'm ready to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rusnak. Because you mentioned the Budapest Memorandum, and unfortunately, I was personally involved in the preparation of this document in 1994, and especially in the last stages of preparation of this document. But unfortunately, it was not legally binding. At least is the correct name of this document, guarantee assurances, not the guarantee, because I made just now for this time just to declare the position of my country. We insist during these negotiations on the negative guarantees, but we are not so successful on this. Thank you very much. The next speaker in my list, this is the president of the Global Security Institute, Mr. Jonathan Granov. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to talk a little bit about some reality, but I want to get a sense of the knowledge base of the audience. How many people here don't know how many nuclear weapons there are in the world? Just give me an idea. Okay. Well, it's pretty significant. So there's somewhere between 13 and 14,000 of them. During the height of the Cold War, do people know how many there were? There were over 65,000. So we've come down considerably. We know how to get rid of them. That's a fact. That's important. It happened because there was a commitment that arose in 1985 when two gentlemen, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, said, a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. But they also said at that meeting, neither of us shall seek military advantage over the other, because there was an insight that Gorbachev had that we needed to shift our perspective from the obsession with military nationalism essentially to a more human-centered approach. He identified the environment, and he identified the nature of modernity as forcing humanity to see itself holistically. That was his insight. So now, let's go a few decades. Where are we today? Today, we now know, we didn't know then, that we're melting the polar ice cap and we're putting the very third lung of the planet, the phytoplankton, at risk. 50 to 70% of our oxygen comes from the phytoplankton. If we continue to change the pH of the oceans, we might lose that. We can have plan A and plan B, but we don't have planet B. We know that we've heated up the planet with as much CO2, hasn't had this much CO2 in over 3.5 million years. We're destroying species at 1,000 to 10,000 times the evolutionary base rate. We've destroyed 60% of the mammals on the planet since 1970. We have dead zones in the ocean. We are putting approximately 5.25 trillion pieces of plastic in the oceans each year. In other words, the way in which we're operating our relationship collectively to the natural world is destroying the regenerative processes of nature. That is a fact. And none of these issues, the climate, pandemics, the oceans, the rainforests, can be solved at the level of the obsession of national militarism. And so, arranging our security around a 5th century Roman maxim, prepare for peace, receive war, prepare for war, receive peace, is no longer realistic. It's dreaming. By accident, design, or madness, those nuclear weapons that are on alert today will be used. And we now know from the science that if less than 1% of them are used, it will cause at least 5 million tons of soot to be in the stratosphere, rendering the agricultural base of civilization dysfunctional, and billions of people will die. We're not talking about a full-scale nuclear exchange, just a minor one. Could this happen? Are we at a risky moment? Absolutely. So let's talk about what has happened in the past. What can we learn? We know that in times of crisis and times of war, in the fog of war, the ability to be reasonable, rational, patient, and analytic diminishes considerably. In 1961, in Goldsboro, North Carolina, there was a Boeing B-52 Stratus Fortress plane going over it, and it crashed. 5 of the crewmen ejected. 1 of them died on the plane. Another one died being ejected. And that plane carried a bomb that was 3 to 4 megatons. That is approximately 210 to 280 Hiroshima bombs in one bomb. And 3 out of 4 of the triggering devices went off. If that 4th triggering device had gone off, it would have gone critical. Over 250 Hiroshimas. An accident. Planes crash. In 1979, there was a senator visiting Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, and somebody wanted to show how efficient our system was, and they put a training tape in the computer. Well, the training tape alerted all of the whole system that there was a full-scale Soviet launch. And we almost went to war. A year later, there was a 46-cent computer chip in a satellite that misread the sunrise. It indicated there were 200 Soviet missiles coming at the United States. In 1983, Stanislav Petrov, who saved the world, was watching the computers in Moscow, and they showed a full-scale American launch. But he didn't pass the information up the command and control because he knew that if he did, 11,000 nuclear warheads would be rained down on the United States. So he violated his protocols and kept it to himself. Why? Because he was a computer engineer, and he told me he believed in God. In 1995, there was a weather satellite launched off of Norway. And when the satellite got to about 1,450 kilometers in the air, it looked to the Russians, because the Soviet Union was over then, it looked to the Russians like a Trident launch of a submarine that would be the initial launch of a high-altitude nuclear explosion, which would fry the electrical system of Russia. The Norwegians had told the Russians they were going to do this, but it didn't get passed up the command and control, and Boris Yeltsin had 8 minutes to decide whether to launch his arsenals before the high-altitude explosion. But he said that he didn't see that Bill Clinton would do something like that. We're not in a world today where there's that kind of security, where there's that kind of trust. So Kazakhstan, it's logical that Kazakhstan would take a leading role in trying to get us back to some degree of sanity, because it's a country that understands that people matter. So it doesn't have animus to any other countries. It's the only country in the world with excellent relations with the United States, China, India, and Russia, because it's a multicultural country that knows that the abuses of modern technology are real. There's over 1.5 million people there with cancers, leukemias, horrific birth defects because of the nuclear testing that took place on the soil of Kazakhstan. So it's in the DNA of the country to deal with it realistically, which I must say as an American, we don't deal with this realistically. And I dare say that in discussions, even in this august conference, the centrality of this issue is not being recognized. Because if we get every other issue right and miss this one, it won't matter. And if any of these errors lead to an exchange, nothing else matters. This is the moral and litmus test of modernity. So we've been gathering in this global alliance of leaders, and I'm going to read some of the language that we're working with to give a sharing of what we think could be done now, and just some of the analysis that we have, and then the conclusion of what we think is something that can be achieved that will help reduce the risk and hopefully create a little bit safer space and momentum in the right direction. It's a modest proposal. It's not the treaty banning nuclear weapons. It's not even the test ban treaty. It's very modest, but it's very meaningful. So we believe that the chance of actual use of nuclear weapons is higher than in any previous point in history. All nuclear states should unilaterally confirm that they will not use nuclear weapons first. No institution or other mechanisms is required for such a no first use policy. In a world enthralled by great power politics, someone must speak out on behalf of humanity, of our shared interest as a species. Out of the 193 members of the United Nations, only 9 possess nuclear weapons, yet the costs of a nuclear war will be borne by all. Modern science highlights the severe climate risk associated with a nuclear war. And I'm just going to read sections of it. It's not long, but time is of the essence.
But
Most of the regimes...
But this document is still under consideration.
It's still under consideration.
Because now, so I would like just to say that we are looking to finalize the language of this document within the dinner.
Yeah, so it's in consideration, but let's consider it. Most of the regime's treaties and mutual assurances, constructive ambiguities, norms, and technical mechanisms that were meant to govern nuclear weapons disarmament have in recent years eroded the nuclear taboo that we all depend upon. We need to recognize that as a fact. I've been to every nuclear non-proliferation treaty conference since 1995. So I spent the month of August at the NPT conference, and I've never seen such cynicism before. It was really disturbing. I mean, because the currency of the realm for trust has been corroded, and trust is more important than anything. And that's the worst consequence of Ukraine, is that trust has, and the failure to live up to commitments that have been made. Test ban treaty, fissile material cutoff treaty, lowering the operational status of the weapons. So we need to face an inconvenient truth. The deterrence-driven stability of the Cold War was linked to bipolarity, but in a multipolar world, the risks of miscalculation increase. We're at the beginning of a new nuclear arms race. Nuclear arsenals are again growing for the first time in decades. Technological developments and countermeasures and threats of actual use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states add to the grim situation. I mean, just think of this. The purpose of nuclear weapons is to pursue security. But the more the weapons are perfected, the more they're modernized, the less security we obtain. So the how is contrary to the why. And right now, the process of modernization only increases the likelihood of use and the severity of use should that occur. For progress to be made, the world must engage with the nuclear powers. The most pressing issue for our collective safety is to reduce the chance of nuclear weapons being used. To this end, the taboo against the use must be strengthened. No first use is a low-hanging fruit. China and India already have such policies in place. For the non-nuclear states, such a pledge should be treated as a sign of decency, and I would say human decency, because at the end of the day, these horrific devices that we've created to bring about security are all about a loss of our humanity. The idea that in order to protect something that we've created, states, created in the 1640s to stop religious war in Europe, things that we've created, we're willing to put the entire future of humanity at risk.
Yeah.
So I will end with a quote from a manifesto written by Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell. They said, "Remember your humanity, forget the rest." Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, we have additional 15 minutes, but it doesn't mean that we have some 2 hours before. But Jonathan, thank you very much, as usual. We are very well known in this planet as the strongest defender of the human security concept. And it's absolutely very well known. And I would like just to, this morning, if I say, yes, we have Plan B, but we have no Planet B.
No, you can have Plan A and Plan B, but you can't have Planet A and B.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, so I would like to give the floor to Les Sims, Director of International Forum for Understanding. It is, but we, the last speaker in my list, it will be Ariel Cohen, and he prepared a very, very, very good intervention, and I just specially reserved it as a last shoot from my panel session. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Is that good? First of all, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for the August panel, and thank you, Mark, for the invitation. I'd just like to say a bit about the International Forum for Understanding. I founded it about 2 years ago, and the whole aim of it was to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals and their delivery, and more importantly, their implementation, but with a key word being understanding. But also making that the arguments within the Sustainable Development Goals accessible not just to academics or anyone with an IST or an ologist or anything, but able to make that and able to, you know, for particularly the young generation to take part in a debate without having to know the specifics or all the academic ins and outs of a particular subject. Because what I was finding was post-pandemic and also prior to that, some of the big subjects like nuclear weapons and you know, the COVID situation was causing a lot of anxiety, but people were just looking at it and then looking away. Too big, too difficult. So I decided to form that, and literally most of the time I work with youth, and we run projects in Syria, we run projects in Yemen. I'll be going the week after next to Chernihiv in Ukraine, where we're running projects, in Africa, in Europe and in the US, because we also work on things like human trafficking, modern day slavery, gender-based violence, all linked to the SDGs. This brings me though to nuclear disarmament. Once again, the SDGs are something that everyone has signed up to. And it also, within all of that, whether it's peace and security, gender-based violence, education, there's a way to link all of the subjects that we're talking about, whether it's climate change, environmental change, women's education, nuclear security, can all be linked to the SDGs, and every single country signed up to that, including Iran and North Korea. So that's why I thought it would be good, and also it's a way to explain it for youth, to explain it in any context, including to the UN. And I include that the corporate world in that. Obviously, a lot of the big corporates have signed up to the Global Compact. And the way I view the SDGs is nothing more than a business plan for the planet, if you like. And what we do with the project is I don't start at the top. I start the project in country and I turn the telescope the other way around. For instance, we started our project in Chernihiv and we started our project in Syria, where people have already been working for 15 years in the case of Syria on the situation there. And in Chernihiv, they were working pre the invasion of Ukraine on things like mental health issues and various other things. But now we're working on regeneration. The reason I do it that way, and I'll just go a bit into my background. As I mentioned, I'm not an academic. I was in the British military for 30 years. leaving in 2005 and involved in all of the various conflicts from 75 through to 2005. Then went into our diplomatic service and spent some time in there. From there, I went into the UN and was head of counter-narcotics in Afghanistan. And then the commercial world. So I still work in part of my feet in the commercial world and part with the implementation of the iFound. The reason I'm so keen on the subjects we're talking across here, Angela's level and every level, is what I was seeing was what I call, in my own way, there's a horizontal dialogue taking place. NPT, you've heard all the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the ban treaty, if you like, the TPNW, JCPOA. There's a whole raft, and CTBT. There's a whole raft of things taking place. But the one thing I wasn't seeing was what I call a horizontal debate, which is intergenerational debate. So what I'm trying to do is to encourage that intergenerational debate. And if you'd all just like to take a look around the room now and look at the gender balance is pretty good, but how many people are there below the age of 30 in the room? And it's very important that we engage with those people. The reason I'm so keen on it is that during my service, I trained as an NBC, nuclear, biological and chemical warfare instructor. So all of the nasty things that have been mentioned here, I was trained to defend against, but also to deploy. And part of that role was monitoring other nuclear forces, including the Russian nuclear forces. And I was deployed in Israel, so regardless of what you think about the situation in the First Gulf, I was deployed in Israel as liaison with the Israelis, but also to train the core staff in NBC to get into their kit, wear their masks, etc. And at the same time, obviously, I had colleagues in the desert that were tracking the deliveries of Scuds, and our job was to warn when they were incoming towards Israel, where we could. Following that, I joined the Joint Arms Control Implementation Group, so the INF Treaty, the whole range of nuclear forces nuclear weapons that were withdrawn from the battlefield. I trained instructors from NATO nations and non-NATO nations how to actually go on the ground and carry out inspections, and also hosted incoming inspections to the UK from Russia, Belarus, and other people. Speaking to the situation we're in now, the motto of that unit, the Joint Arms Control Implementation Group, which is still in existence now, it was formed in '91. Now it's reduced to small arms, looking at small arms and negotiations of small arms reduction. But it was in Latin, perfidem mutuum securitas, which means security through mutual trust. And that shows the level of optimism, because we were actually dealing with Russian inspectors. We got to know these guys that were dealing with these systems, and they got to know us. And we had that level of communication, that human contact that Jonathan and I have talked a lot about. So that brings us now to the nuclear climate. We know obviously about the threats that were made by Putin. And obviously that, the use of tactical nuclear weapons, in my mind, there's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. And we've also, the other thing that's gradually crept in is we almost seem to accept biological and chemical weapons. And if you've seen the effect of these weapons, as I have, including in Syria, we wouldn't be so blasé about that being, that red line has been crossed so many times, it's not funny. What I've tried to focus on with the youth that I'm working with is the environmental and nuclear nexus. With the environmental situation, we've walked into it pretty much in the early stages, and then we've stumbled into it almost blind. With the nuclear weapons and biological and chemical weapons, we've empowered our systems and our governments, and we still elect people that are able to put their finger on that nuclear button, and everyone in this room has voted at some stage for a government that's going to do that and make that decision on our behalf. So we're actually empowering people to initiate our own destruction, in my mind. And we're actually paying for the privilege. I'd like you to reflect on this for a bit. And as I said, I'm not coming with answers. I'd just like you to think about a few things, referring to what Jonathan has said also. In 2021, earlier on we discussed these Sustainable Development Goals and the various economic situations, global logistics situations. The 9 nuclear states, remember 5 of those are Security Council members, and at the moment we know how dysfunctional that is, spent 82.4 billion on nuclear weapons. And that's 6.5 billion up on 2020. So this is before Ukraine, before the war in Ukraine. Now, these figures are taken from ICANN. There will be others. I'm just using these as representational. Of that, private companies were awarded contracts of 30.2 billion, and that's a conservative estimate, which is up 14.8 billion on the previous year, on 2020. The companies themselves, bear in mind the money we took through, spent 117 million on lobbyists, and I'll come on to that in a moment, and 5 to 10 million on think tanks. That's the money that we've put into those companies has gone into that situation. And this is one really that made me ponder. The Swedish International Peace and Research Institute, which do some great work, and their statistics are very reliable on all sorts of subjects. In 2021, for the first time, military expenditure was 2.1 trillion, went over the trillion mark, and that was last year. Again, I dread to think what it's going to be like this year and coming through to it. But that's not the thing that shocked me. The thing that shocked me was that's the 7th consecutive increase. So, we're looking at a rising. It's not, and this, I know, translates into military forces. And actually, military forces translate into casualties. I know that from experience. I won't go into all the other things that the other panelists have mentioned, the non-proliferation treaty review. However, as the ambassador mentioned and all mentioned, the Budapest Memorandum, which was meant to protect once Kazakhstan had given up its nuclear arsenal, was meant to protect Belarus and Ukraine, was ignored by the US, Britain, and Russia. Simply ignored. Obviously, support's being provided, but the recommendations were given, and France and China actually made a sub-letter on that.
With the reservations.
Yeah. And today, as we heard, the New START treaty, Russia pulled out at short notice. I was hoping there might be something from that, but sadly not. Now that brings me to what I'm doing and relating to some of the discussions we've had today. I focused a lot of my efforts on the COP, on the Climate Change Conference. In COP26 in Glasgow, I ran a side event on nuclear weapons and climate change, which we attracted a large audience for and have promulgated some of the work from that. This year in COP27, I took a team of 8 young people to COP with the only remit was to go and have a look at it. And they were all specialists in their own right, one from Kazakhstan that comes from Semipalatinsk, and I'll come on to her later. A young lady from Syria that we're working with, a lady from Jordan, one from Uganda, and a couple of others. The only remit is I know that COP28 is going to be in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, in fact. And I said, look, go and have a look. Have a look at what's happening in the green zone. One of the youngsters that we took is an English 19-year-old that has already managed to establish a youth group in the UN. And he was in the blue zone. And we did the rounds of the blue zone, the green zone, the innovation zone, looking for any indication of a link between nuclear weapons and climate. Nothing, nada, during the whole of COP27. So on that, I'd like to give a closing thought, really, or ask you to think about it. COP28, we're in a strange position. The reason I'm so keen about implementation is I was in a position where I was helping to implement the Millennium Development Goals from embassies in places like Nepal during a conflict, a Maoist conflict there, and other locations. And pretty much it's agreed that the MDGs failed because of lack of implementation. It's also why I asked the question about Ukraine, because things weren't just reaching the ground where they need it. This year, COP27 is 7.5 years into the SDGs, the SDG 2030. COP28 gives us 7.5 years left to deal with these situations. So on the basis of that, I'd like you all to think what actually you could do, or look at your children or grandchildren and think what you could do to raise this up the political agenda, because the nuclear climate nexus just isn't anywhere as far as debate's concerned. Thank you.
Les, thank you very much for your intervention. And now, I would like to introduce Dr. Ariel Cohen, Senior Fellow, Atlantic Council Director of Energy and Growth and Security Program and International Tax and Investment Center, something like this. But this is a top-level expert in Washington, D.C. on the post-Soviet area. It's definitely, yes. Thank you. Ariel, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Yes, great. Afternoon panels on the second day of a conference are tough, but I'll try to be brief. I'm getting messages already to wrap up. After we listened for 2 days, probably unprecedentedly grim assessments of economic management, of security management, of environmental management, I would like to take one case study, and that is a case study of nuclear reactors in war zones, and see what can we learn about it. Can I have some water, please? The International Convention of Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials and the international humanitarian law are the dispositive pieces of legislation, of international legislation, that should be providing security to nuclear reactors. Why is it important? Number one, because if, for example, a 6-reactor Zaporizhzhia reactor, 1,000 megawatt each, is compromised, you can imagine what catastrophic consequences that will raise. But not just for Ukraine, for nuclear security in general. We are facing unprecedented complications in terms of climate change. Climate change is caused by CO2 emissions. Nuclear reactors generate electric power with 0 nuclear emissions. It would stand to reason the responsible leaders would go out of their way to maintain security of these nuclear reactors, right? And when you start sort of diving into these pieces of international law, I'm not practicing international law. I'm a lawyer in my past life. But you find out that there's no enforcement mechanisms. There are no even a stipulation how this can be imposed. IAEA went out of its way. They sent the mission to Ukraine. They talked to the Russians again and again, try to implement a modicum of security for Zaporizhzhia and to figure out what's going on in Chernobyl. And in Chernobyl, there are residual materials that if mishandled, if the site is compromised, can again cause catastrophic consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of time, I'll just give you my bottom line. The international mechanism to secure these reactors is broken. I'm not even sure it was designed to function, but it is not functioning. And if there's one thing that keeps you up at night, is an insecure, darn nuclear reactor, as the Europeans found out with Chernobyl, as the Japanese and the rest of the world found out with Fukushima. Now, let's take another incident where a foolproof security mechanism should have been created and was not. And that is the Budapest Memorandum that Ambassador Abusseitov was involved in its creation. The Budapest Memorandum presupposed back in 1994 that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia, then quasi-democratic, the United States, the United Kingdom, will never need to do anything dramatic to keep the territorial integrity of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan secure. Therefore, the measures that would make, for one of the parties, inconceivable to compromise the territorial integrity of these then newly independent states were not designed in that memorandum. Allowing Russia today, roll the film almost 30 years later, 28 years later, allowing Russia today, over the period of several last years, not just in February of this year, but before, since 2014, to violate the territorial integrity of Ukraine. The war did not start on February 24th of this year. It started in 2014, when they grabbed the Crimea and started war in Donbass. But in my travels to Moscow before COVID, I also found out that the Russian elites deliberately want to raise the heat of potential nuclear escalation vis-à-vis Washington, referring explicitly to the, quote, the Cuban Missile Crisis moment, unquote, in order to get, as they put it, the equal eye-level position, the equality of strategic posture between Moscow and Washington, and therefore getting the genie of nuclear blackmail out of the bottle. I will stop here and let it sink and move on to my conclusions. I've written 3 pieces on the bureaucratic failure of preventing a SARS-type infection after COVID started. SARS-type infections were not unknown. It was not a black swan. They happened again and again for 20 years preceding COVID. And when you go by every possible criteria, and I was focusing on the US, every administration, Democrat or Republican, ignored the writing on the wall, culminating with the Trump administration canceling the office at the National Security Council that was supposed to deal with this type of epidemics. Lisa, nothing to do with your work there. Why am I bringing COVID up? Why should I bring the inflation rates up, the inflation rate in the discussion about Ukraine, about the nuclear reactors, and about the Budapest Protocol? Because I will submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that all these events were predictable, and it was an enormous lack of leadership that led to economic policy, environmental policy, health policy, and security policy failures. It was not done by people who are crazy extremist, although I would argue, that's my personal opinion, Russia is trending in a very worrisome direction ideologically. It wasn't done by certifiable insane people. It was done by leaders who failed in their leadership responsibilities. I would probably venture, I'm not a historian of World War I, I would probably venture and say that the leadership failure before World War I may be comparable with what we're witnessing now. And the question probably for our next meeting would be, what can be done besides the obvious? Raising public awareness, working with youth, talking to diplomats, talking to decision makers. What can be done to recognize that the world, that is a very complex mechanism today? Because look what we're looking at here. We're looking at health care policy failure, economic policy failure, nuclear failure, diplomatic failure, etc. It's a very complex mechanism in which competence and leadership together may be the answer to resolve these events and to prevent these birds, which are not black swans again. It was all predictable. All the writings are on the wall, to prevent them from causing real catastrophes in which not just 6 million people that died, or 7 million, died of COVID, not tens of thousands or close to 100,000 that die in Ukraine, but many, many million of people who may die tomorrow. With that, I would thank the organizers, I would thank Ambassador Abusseitov and Astana Forum, and offer my modest prayer for our future. Thank you.
Ariel, thank you very much. Because I received a message that we have no any time limits for questions from audience, but anyhow, I have just 1 minute just to say thank you to all speakers of this very important panel, and I would like just to invite you to continue our discussions within this evening dinner. Thank you very much. Thank you.
C'est le passé.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Sorry, no, it's okay. Because we are one of my guest ministers.
Yeah. Listen, I got to stay in touch with you.
Or you. And about my one, EURASIA self-obsessed. That's the idea. That's the word. So half of the time doesn't work. Jerry. Very smart. Really. Oh, they're sending messages before we start.
But I didn't admit it. You lose the UN.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
is there another?
Chloe. No, I
Are you serious?
There's another. Some of the interpretations I'm reading is that they're not enough to enforce. And they need to be. Correct me if I'm wrong, because you know so much more about it. On what level the UN needs to make a determination? Hey, good to see you. On what level do you need to make a determination in order to? What? Yeah, let's get off. Yeah. I don't know.
Okay, let me ask the member of the panel. Oui, c'est la dernière fois, c'est bon.
Do you use? It's German, right? Schande. Yeah, it's used in Yiddish. Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
sorry, we need to...
yeah, I'm around. When are you leaving?
Vous avez mis les trucs là?
Well, at 11:30. I think two I could do in the morning. Yes.
Let's do breakfast.
Okay, perfect. I'll be near in the 6th. All right, I'm not very far. I'm at the National Assembly. It's on the 7th.
Oh, you want me
It's at the end of, yeah, it's quite close. It's at the end of Boulevard Saint-Germain.
Okay. And I'm so proud of you that you're there.
Thank you, thank you.
C'est bon, c'est bon. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let me first introduce our chair, Mr. Benjamin Haddad, who is a member of our parliament here in France. He's going to share the session. If you can take your seat, please. Bernard. Bernard. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt the conversation, but we would like to complete and finish our session that conclude also the theme of our conference, The Age of Resilience. We are very pleased to have a very good panel that will be chaired by Mr. Benjamin Haddad, who is a member of our French Parliament. Mr. Haddad will need to leave at 6, so just in case he will need to take I will take over when he will need to leave. So apologies for this, but we were delayed with since the morning because we have, of course, a very eclectic group of speakers and long conversation and questions. So, Mr. Haddad, thank you for this being very pragmatic and practical, and thanks also for joining us today. We have a very strong panel that will clearly conclude also the theme of our conference, The Age of Resilience. Over to you, and thank you for you being very practical and pragmatic. Please.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Benjamin Haddad. I'm a member of the French Parliament. I'm the spokesperson for Emmanuel Macron's party, Renew, here in Parliament. I apologize in advance that I'll have to leave at 6. That's the joy of having a relative majority in Parliament, is that every vote really counts, so we have to run back to session. I'm really delighted to be moderating this terrific conversation. I think we've had a couple days of very fruitful conversations about Ukraine, about energy, climate, macroeconomic shocks, and this is going to be the concluding roundtable. So I think maybe we can take sort of a step back and take stock also of the conversations. And I guess for this conversation on resilience, which is a very broad topic, and we have 3 experts here who are going to each talk about it with their perspective, I guess I'm just going to ask quite of a broad question that I'd love all of you to answer from your own field. When you look at the different shocks that our Western economies have been going through in the last few years, COVID, and now the consequences of the war in Ukraine, it strikes me that we have something like what the French call des injonctions contradictoires, which is contradictory demands or conclusions that we're drawing from them. On the one hand, when we're thinking about resilience, we're thinking about sovereignty. We're thinking about the fact that we realized with COVID that we were dependent on other economies, on other countries for critical needs in terms of pharmaceuticals or masks. We realized the limits of the supply chains on which our economies had been used to depending. Same thing with the shocks that we're experimenting with Ukraine. There's a lot of talk in Europe and France, especially about energy independence, energy sovereignty, about reinvesting also on critical technology, on military needs, and depending less on foreign and other actors. On the one hand, you have this, and on the other hand, there's a greater call, obviously, for greater international cooperation, for multilateralism. When you look at some of the biggest challenges that we face, from obviously the climate crisis to the question of migration, for example, there's no solitary solution. And as the president here likes to say, France or Europe is not an island, and we need to cooperate. And so when you think about resilience, I'd love to ask all of you, how do we reconcile this growing call for autonomy, for sovereignty, for self-sufficiency, and on the other hand, this need for cooperation and reinventing multilateralism? So as I said, it's a very broad question, but I think it touches upon a lot of the issues that we've talked about in the last couple of days. Maybe I'll start first with you, Phoebe Kondori. Phoebe Kondori is, I think, doesn't need an introduction. Is one of the best-known economists in the world, especially on the question of sustainable development, the environment, but I would say even the sort of the cross-section between man, nature, the environment, and a lot of the global challenges that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Well, the crises are multiple and they are happening simultaneously. So we had the health crisis that we all recognize because it was easy to see. It was happening in a very intensive way. We could see deaths around us that we didn't have the health system to really control. We also face the economic crisis that has not really recovered since the financial crisis. Then we have fiscal crisis around different places in the world, and especially some located even in Europe, one of the most developed economies across the world. Now we are facing inflationary pressures. We have the climate crisis, the increased intensity and frequency of extreme weather events that is killing thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people across the world, and is costing billions every year. We have the biodiversity collapse. It's a very, very difficult crisis because it's the collapse of the ecosystem, so which our production and consumption is based. And then we had the energy crisis that started before the war in Ukraine, and it has been intensified by the war, the actual food crisis. And when you look in a broad sense around you, you see also the population crisis and the increased inequality crisis. So many crises happening simultaneously. I don't think the answer is to go back into islands. The answer is to identify our goals. Our goals have been signed by 193 countries, as it has been mentioned many times, 17 SDGs, 169 goals, 300 KPIs. We can measure the UN 2030 agenda implementation, performance of each and every country, of each and every region, of each and every municipality. And we have also, and when I say we can measure, actually the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, I'm honored to chair the European Hub. It's a network of 1,800 universities, and our priority is to help the implementation of the SDGs. And every year since 2015, we measure in a quantifiable way the performance of each and every country, but also regions and also cities and also municipalities against the SDGs. And now my team, a quite big research alliance of about 200 researchers, we have transposed this SDG framework for businesses. So we can measure the performance against the SDGs. The SDGs is a holistic, systemic, integrated framework where I agree with what has been said before, within which we can devise investment programs for the different scales that we are interested in, and we can assess and monitor the performance of these investment programs. So the idea is how we can put the SDG 17, the last SDG about cooperation, into the spotlight, and then create the capacity that is needed for this very science-intensive, systemic, holistic, integrated, interdisciplinary plan, the SDGs, to be implemented. It's difficult. It's very difficult. And the capacity is not there. among the stakeholders. The politicians do not know how to implement it, on average, of course. The policymakers do not know how to transpose this into national laws and regulations. The businessmen do not have the capacity to transpose it into their business plans. The financial institutions do not have the capacity for the correct transposition. The civil society does not have it. So, what do we need? We need serious capacity building, first of all, in order to truly engage all the stakeholders at the different scales, at municipalities, at nations, at continents, in the global and multilateral institutions, in order to understand that there is a solution that can simultaneously address the different crises, in order to understand that the solution is implementable, in order to understand that this solution is science-driven and we need to create a serious interface between science, policy making, and politics, and we need to convince the people that they have to make this investment and the governments to finance this investment for capacity building in order to have a true engagement in the SDGs implementation. 2030 is not possible. My work on the simulation of growth models that endogenize natural capital, human capital, and of course, productive capital, show that the regenerative capacity of nature, the capacity of human capital to endorse, to adopt technological progress, and the pace of technological progress does not allow us to implement the SDGs by 2030. However, and interestingly so, the European Union has identified this. The European Commission has got this. 2050 seems possible. So let's decide to keep the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, the 169 targets, the many KPIs that we use to measure them. Let's decide to keep them the same until 2050. They are gaining momentum at the moment. They are being integrated into policy making. People start to understand them, being politicians, policymakers, financial, people from the finance industry, the businesses, the civil society. And then let's really try to work on detailing and downscaling the pathways, the technological innovation pathways, the policy pathways, and the financial pathways that will allow the implementation of this very demanding but truly important framework, because it really allows us to go to resilience and, of course, sustainability. So my research and my interface with policy making really makes one pledge. And having come from COP27, I have 14 different engagements there. My pledge is, let's create the capacity and let's put a lot of emphasis on non-state actors, because the last message, I think the message from the COP, this year, and I've been going to the COPs for 20 years with very active participation, representing different institutions and associations, and this year as the president of the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. The main message was that state actors achieved few things, mainly the loss and damage fund, and non-state actors achieved quite a bit. An agreement on green financing, an agreement on adaptation, an agreement on nature-based solutions, an agreement on different aspects of sustainable urban transformation. So I put a lot of emphasis on science, on non-state actors, but also let's allow all these different stakeholders to create a true pressure through explicit demand for a sustainability pathway that is seriously figured out in each and every country and allows for consideration for the interlinkages between the countries, the positive and the negative spillovers. Let's keep this agenda for 2050 and let's focus on implementing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, very eloquent call for a science, KPI-driven, multi-stakeholder approach to reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. Maybe I'm going to turn to the interlocutor on your left, Enrico Giovannini.
The machine to make the slides.
Sure. Sorry. You're an economist as well. You are a political figure. You were until recently a minister for infrastructure and transportation in the Draghi government in Italy. And I'd love for you to bounce back a little bit on what was just said. And when we talk about engaging non-state actor, when we talk about a KPI and science-driven approach, including multiple stakeholders, do you think politicians and statesmen can get that right? I mean, I think that's a huge challenge. And I asked, I'm very biased. I asked as a former scholar who just got into politics. I think it's a very relevant question.
Can I move there so I can?
Sure.
Because the slides cannot be seen from there. Well, good afternoon to those who decided to remain to know the name of the killer, because the title of this conference was The End of Abundance, and it was clear that we are really running out of abundance, but the birth of resilience. Well, maybe, and I will answer, of course, your question. I have to say that I don't know what you were doing 46 years ago, in 1976. I was deciding as a student at university to become an economist, to give a helping hand to the world that was going to be a messy world around 2020, 2030. Did I have the crystal ball? No. I was just giving credit to the clever Rome, the limits to growth, 1972. And you see here the dotted lines that were one of the scenarios that were built 50 years ago, and the continuous lines are the actual data. I know that at this point, some people leave the room just to spend the last few hours with their families, and like the movies with the asteroids coming on the Earth, because it's quite impressive that that model, and this is the point I want to make, were able to predict the incredible growth of GDP, population, and so on. And what we want to avoid is the right-hand side of the chart, because those predictions were telling us that after reaching 8 billion people now, we could go back to 6 billion by the end of the century. Now, is this completely crazy? just to remember this tweet from Ursula von der Leyen with this very nice, because it missed the war, it missed the energy crisis, but was showing that several shocks could have hit our society. Yesterday, some people were talking about the definition of complex systems. I just wrote here the definition from Wikipedia, which is not what we have used in terms of conceptual frameworks for 50 years. We thought that the economy would have driven everything. We thought that the environment was not a problem because, of course, the development was just reaching a few million people in the world, that society would have followed the economics and so on, while we forgot that all these systems are interrelated. And therefore, we made wrong decisions, not one big wrong decision, because you see, from moving from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, where you have different words, high risks, low resilience, or low risks, high resilience, well, we made several decisions then progressively led us to the question that we have in this conference. Where are we? I think that just listening to all the speakers, we are in the last down world, full of risks, very low resilience. Can we move up? This is the question. Phoebe has just mentioned the 17 goals, but I want to represent something maybe different. What is the complex system that we are living? We exchange with the rest of the universe solar energy, and we put waste heat. And then what we do is to use natural capital, human capital, social capital, build capital, to combine them in a production process to produce GDP. And then we reinvest or we consume part of them depending on our choices and so on and so forth, in order to increase our well-being. But the way in which we organize the production has an impact on well-being if you use slaves, if you use well-paid workers and so on. But on top, what we do is that we create waste. Physical waste that have an impact on ecosystem services. And until this is in all textbooks of economics that are built on sustainability since 1990. And then what I added is the socio-economic systems and services, which are affected by what Pope Francis calls human waste. Now, if you put the 17 goals on this scheme, you understand that those goals are not just a list, but are attempts to modify the way in which the system works, including the goal 16, peace, which is exactly one of the ways to avoid that the social systems, which is about peace and so on, could collapse. So if you have this in mind, then you can start thinking about how resilience gets into this picture. Personally, my story with resilience started in 2014, when we developed the Human Development Report that was exactly on reducing vulnerabilities and building resilience. Then I would recommend, if you don't know, that publication, The Government, in 2071, and then finally the 2020 Strategic Foresight Report of the European Commission. I bear the responsibility of obliging everybody to talk about the European Plan for Recovery and Resilience. because with the work done at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, we had prepared the general framework for resilience that was used by the von der Leyen's cabinet in response to the 2020 crisis. These are some references. Just a note, when I organized as consultant, when I stepped down my first experience as Minister of Labor and Social Policies in Italy, I organized a conference. The head of cabinet of President Juncker, maybe you have known him, Martin Selmayr, asked the person who was in charge of the academic group that was working on that to tell me they had to stop about sustainability and resilience. Because, he said, there is no way to tell people that the future is full of shocks. We, anyway, worked on this topic, and we developed this framework where we put together the time of exposure and the disturbance intensity. If the impact is low or lasts for a short term, we can absorb. Otherwise, we have to adapt. Otherwise, we have to transform. Well, this is the 2008 Lehman Brothers crisis that, in my view, was in that area. The sovereign debt crisis in 2010. And in fact, we, in Europe, changed some rules. Then 2015, the asylum crisis, that maybe you have forgotten, but the European Union risked to collapse because of 0.5% flow of European population in terms of immigrants, very small fraction, but risked to have the collapse of the European Union. 2020, the pandemic, 2022, the crisis, the war, and so the question is, what's next? Was just bad luck, or something got wrong, or was broken? Well, if the system must be resilient, we have to consider both the resilience of assets, resilience of the engine, the way in which we work, in order to have resilient outcomes. This is about policies, Chair. This is about the way in which we make decisions. And I tried to make decisions of allocating, over the last 22 months, 105 billion euros, having this in mind, including resilience of railways, traces, for example. We have interpreted resilience for a long time as a way to bounce back to where a country was before a shock. And also in economics, this was the classical way of thinking about resilience. So if country A gets back quicker than country B, we have to follow the policies of country A. This is what we have done at the OECD when I was chief statistician there, what we have done in Europe, and so on and so forth. But why should we go back to where we were if we were on an unsustainable pathway? This is the fundamental question today. Do we really want to go back to where we were before the most recent crisis? I think that we shouldn't go back to that. And we have to steer both the long-term policies and short-term policies, because also the short-term is very important. What we have done at the JRC was to rethink completely the division of labor between economic, social, environmental policies, trying to redesign them according to policies that prevent shocks, that prepare for shocks, that protect from shocks, that promote the resilience, and also that transform. And why is this so important? Because it depends on where you think you are in the map that we have described. If you think that you are in the stability area, you can absorb the shock. If you think that you are in a flexibility area, you must adapt. Otherwise, you have to transform. If you made the mistake in detecting in which area you are going to make wrong decisions. So this is the point. And I just conclude saying that even listening to some speakers today, I think that we really need a new way of thinking, system thinking, complex system thinking. This is the very last publication by the Kleber Rhone just issued a few weeks ago, where again, non-linear complex models have been used in order to show that there is a possible pathway to reach the 17 goals. We are not lost completely, but of course, we need to change our way of thinking. And my question, this is a simplified flow chart of the model, and my recommendation is to look at that and see whether you have in mind this conceptual map or only part of it. Because just going back to the previous scheme that I mentioned before, if you are an economist, you just look at the lower part of the chart. Your target is producing GDP, and then this is what you do. And you try to maximize that without really caring about other things that are part of the system. If you are a sociologist, you look at part of the system, and so, or environmentalist, and so on and so forth. So the good news is that, as Phoebe said, we have research, we have a possible policy framework, but indeed we need to rethink dramatically the way in which even governments are organized. And I stop here just reminding you about the OECD work on policy coherence for sustainable development. And just going back to this report in 2018, which looks at the very future ways in which public sector has to work, it's interesting that they see, this is one of the already mentioned institutes for future studies in Dubai, but not only in Dubai, where you have government, governance and resilience, economy and society, environmental, and finally, but not less important, is future and foresight. Therefore, I think that we have some instruments, not necessarily all the instruments, to rethink the way in which we behave, the way in which we think, the way in which we look at the future, using resilience as a focal point, and for example, the establishment of ministries that look across governments in terms of resilience and future is a good idea. And this is what in our field of competence, but you know, the Ministry for Sustainable Infrastructures and Mobility, this was the name that I gave to the ministry, the new name, and the new government has already decided to go back to transport and infrastructures, counseling sustainability. I think we have the possibility of making different economic policies very much more coherent with our goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrico, Giovanni. That was very rich, and I think there's a lot to pick up on. Talking about bouncing back, resilience, and not going back necessarily to where we were before.
Bouncing forward.
Bouncing forward, exactly. I'd love to turn to you as Guy Johnson, the governor of the Central Bank of Iceland, which I think is a great success story and what we're talking about, you're an economist as well. You were both in academia and in public policy. Would love to have your reaction on all of this.
Well, thank you. We had this a huge financial crisis in 2008, and Iceland had this absolute dream of becoming a financial center. And this is basically our banking system. And we got a absolute AAA rating in 2002, and on the back of that rating, we were going to be a financial center, and that had a very bad end, because in the end, the Central Bank of Iceland did not really have the printing power to bail out the banks. It is very unlike the ECB or the US Fed. And there was no use of printing our currency, the kroner, for banks that needed euros and dollars. So the whole banking system went down. And we basically cut the foreign part of the system. We recapitalized the domestic part of the system, and the foreign part was put into liquidation. But it was much more than that, because this was a crisis which we thought was basically risking our very independence. And if you remember the ISAF issue, for example. So the crisis has basically made resilience, or how to fortify our country in every possible way, a main goal in our politics. And I will only be going through the policies turning on the financial sector. We also have policies concerning the power sector. We have almost totally decarbonized Iceland. 90% of the households use geothermal energy for houses. The rest hydro energy, and we are in the good. We are well on the way of basically turning our car fleet into electric power. The last bastion is the fishing fleet. We also have actually sustainable fisheries also. So our main focus has been this is the corporate sector, which was quite leveraged. The main focus on is to prevent leverage to form again. And the whole sector was reorganized and recapitalized after the crisis. And this is household debt, which we have also kept stable over this time. And this is a much lower, the ratio of the debt to income is about 150, which is much lower than in Europe. In Scandinavia, ratios of 200-300 or 300 even are quite common. So this has been our policy. This is our net foreign position, which was quite negative and is now positive. And this was done also through the tourist boom. But there has been a very deliberate policy of preventing leverage or the external balance of the country to turn negative again. And one of the key factors is the central bank, which was unified with the FSA of Iceland, and probably creating the most powerful entity in our independent history. Icelanders have an apathy for central power. This is a nation without king. Our sagas say that we came from Norway, so we could live on this island without any kings. So there is a great apathy to central power. So the institution that I'm running has been given kind of an extraordinary power in a nation that basically hates central power. And these are the four key features of our policy. First of all, to get the responsibility quite clear. So with the merger with FSA, the central bank has a clear responsibility in financial stability. And we accept the fact that The same tool can be used on monetary policy, financial stability, and also regulation. So this is all connected. We try to organize our banking system also on back of regulation. So one thing else is to basically keep control over balance of payments. We do that through our foreign reserves, and the central bank intervenes on a regular basis in the market. We limit domestic lending in foreign currency. We limit FX swaps. So basically, speculators, it is very difficult for them to try to speculate on a country. We control leverage ratios and credit creation. We enforce capital ratios in our banks, 20–30%. We use counter-cyclical capital ratios. We have borrower-based measures, probably the toughest in Europe. If you want to buy a house in Iceland, you have to have 20% equity. You have to have show that you are able to pay all your debts. 35% of your income is the maximum you can basically get indebted. And lending in foreign currency is also forbidden. Also, with the regulation, the bonuses in the finance sector are basically banned or very limited. There are capital charges to holding companies just to that basically on stock. So the focus is basically on keeping the system without a leverage. And this is the growth rate of the economy. This is a Nouriel index. And you can see that our economy has grown about 50% since the crisis. 50%. And this is our inflation compared with Europe. And this is the harmonized price index. And admittingly, we have our own power, so we are not affected by the high power prices. And this is my last slide. But so basically, our focus, our policies, and I'm just focusing on the financial policy, because there is an equal focus on our policies regarding our power sources, also of our industries concerning fisheries, for example. And so far, even though we are by the small, Iceland we are only 360,000 people. We are by far the smallest independent currency area in the world. There is no other nation below 2 million inhabitants that has its own currency, own independent currency than we have. And so far we have been doing quite well. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. I think our chair needs to leave for his appointment as a parliament, so I will just take over. I know it's been a long day, but maybe if there is still appetite for one or two questions from the room, please, happy to take it. Yes.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Doesn't work.
Yeah. Switch on the mic. Very interesting presentations, and also I think the connection of the last two presentations is particularly interesting, because I would like to come back to one of the questions that I asked before, which is what is the connection of resilience and sovereignty? I mean, you show you have control on your okay. You have, now it's much better. So what is the connection between resilience and sovereignty. I mean strategic sovereignty. We have seen the complex new, sort of the new way of working that you have pointed out, and I have a lot of comments on that, having worked into government and having worked in business, how difficult it is to have a policy that drives that new framework and politics blocking it. So policy and politics are two different things. And I think, you know, what you have shown is that you managed to really implement policies that really triggered an improvement in resilience. But you have a control on a couple of elements, and you managed to ensure control on a couple of elements, like, I mean, you have the control on the currency, you have the control on energy, so you have your own sort of, I would say, sovereignty on certain things. And I would like to understand how this is linked and how we transfer it to a European situation where we have not all the instruments in one hand. Second, policymakers and politicians are very often driven by different KPIs and by different intentions. And thirdly, you know, we do not have that overarching goal of resilience as main goal.
If I answer this very quickly, I mean, after the financial crisis, Iceland actually applied for a EU membership. Actually, and actually Croatia and Iceland actually applied at the same time, and the EU thought that Iceland would be a very simple case, but Croatia would be difficult, but that turned out to be otherwise. So basically, the nation had to choose between two different strategies: either to join the European Union and become a part of the organizations and kind of hedge our fortunes with the European countries, or to basically go alone. And we decided to actually go alone. And the financial crisis, the ICIF issue, I mean, the British basically enacted a terrorist legislation against us. They basically froze all payments to our country for a month. The Central Bank of Iceland was listed as a terrorist entity, along with Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda. So that experience basically made it into for this nation, made it into a top priority to becoming resilient, that we will never have to risk our sovereignty ever again. So that is basically on backwards policy. And can really answer, I also think that joining the EU would have been a viable strategy, but maybe a different one.
Yes. Well, resilience and strategic sovereignty. You gave the answer already, because we should try to aim to be resilient and therefore have sovereignty where we have the control of the currency. It looks very simple in a sense, and we heard that control of the currency and the energy, but not only, because then we have the other elements, but these two elements are without any doubt absolutely central. But we shouldn't forget, because really I come out of this very gloomy conference, I would say, that the US federal system was built crisis after crisis, because they decided to go federal instead of just state-based solutions, individual states solutions. And we are going through this process without any war, internal war, while the United States had the Civil War. What I'm trying to say is that I believe that European Union can speed up. The resilience indicators are now embedded in the new framework for the European semester that will be used starting 2023. And the work that we have done at the JRC is now elevated in a sense as a set of the indicators of the European semester. We don't have an overarching goal because if you wish, maximization of well-being and then sustainability and resilience of the well-being are, let's say, connected, but they are not the same thing. I like very much what I heard from Iceland, where I saw that you decided to go for a low-risk situation. Yes. This is the fundamental choice that you have done. Ready to pay some prices, but finally, imposing caps and so on, worked. And in my view, this is exactly the type of charts that I showed you before. They, at a certain bifurcation, they decided to go for having low risks. And you can get very positive results.
But may I just point to one thing, you know, the regulation of the EU. The current regulation that the EU is introducing, the Supply Security Act, the all the sustainability related regulation, which makes businesses significantly less competitive, more sustainable potentially, but less competitive.
Now these two elements are contradictory.
Is that helping in making us more resilient? I mean, it down the line in 10 years, but now?
No, it's clear. I don't want to defend all the choices made by European Union, but what I want to say, just let me mention one point, because I know that companies are complaining now, for example, with the regulation on non-reporting, non-financial reporting. The Green Deal was not presented as an environmentalist policy, but as a development policy, under the assumption is that the entire world will go towards sustainability, environmental sustainability. And if we have companies that are on the edge of these, companies will have an incredibly huge market ahead. Now, is it true? Of course, the short-term tensions make the whole story more difficult. But on the other hand, we know in Europe, but not only, that companies that have chosen sustainability clearly, investing in innovation, they are exactly experimenting what the plan was about, not the entire industrial sector, which is at risk of being squeezed. This is clear. So I don't have a clear answer, but on the other hand, I believe that the only alternative to a sustainable world is an unsustainable world, which is exactly what we are talking about for 2 days.
Thank you. On these words, I want to conclude the sessions because, as you can see, the organizers of this place are looking forward for us to go to the dinner place. Yeah. So, practical information, there will be shuttles, they will be leaving at 7 p.m. sharp from this place, Salon de l'Aéro Club, and will bring us to the dinner. And for those of you who are staying at the hotel, they will bring you back tonight. So, 7 p.m., concluding remark at the dinner. Thank you very much. Il arrive.